beneath layers of cracked earth and wind-carved stone, there are places where the ground does not feel empty, even when nothing stands above it anymore. In the heat-hardened silence of southern Mesopotamia, and the forgotten margins of Anatolia and the Levant,
here tells us
archaeologists often describe a strange sensation long before they find anything tangible. The soil seems heavier than it should be, as if it remembers pressure from walls that no longer exist. As if the landscape itself is holding back fragments of something once vast and structured and alive. It is here, under this quiet tension of land and dust, that the first hints of a missing superpower begin to surface. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what makes this absence so unsettling is not just that something was lost, but that something large enough to shape entire regions appears to have been deliberately or systematically removed from the way history remembers itself. Ancient
Look
Egypt
at the
speaks in
detail
stone
on this
with overwhelming
impression.
confidence.
It confirms the
Mesopotamia
Minoan
leaves
connection.
behind libraries
Yes,
baked
I'm
into
logging
clay.
it now.
The Hittites,
The script is
Assyrians,
remarkably
Babylonians, and Egyptians all collide in a dense and well-documented drama of empire. Yet between these familiar names, in both geography and chronology, there are gaps that feel too structured to be accidental. For centuries, those gaps were not even recognised. Early historians assumed silence meant insignificance. If a civilization did not announce itself through monumental architecture or surviving texts, it was treated as peripheral, a minor player in the great stage of antiquity. But archaeology rarely respects assumptions built from absence. It works in reverse, starting from fragments and moving toward reconstruction. Even when the reconstruction challenges what earlier generations believed was complete.
These cylinder
The turning
seal
point came not from
impressions
one
provide a
discovery,
unique
but from a
window
series of
into the
small,
administrative
almost forgettable
bureaucracy
findings
of the
scattered across
ancient
excavation
world.
sites that were originally thought to belong to better-known cultures. Broken seals that did not match known royal iconography, tablets written in scripts that resembled but did not belong to any established language family, pottery styles that appeared too sophisticated for the supposed cultural context in which they were found. At first, each anomaly was explained away: misclassification, trade goods, later disturbance of layers, human error in interpretation. But anomalies have a way of accumulating. In a shallow trench near the upper Euphrates, fragments of administrative records emerged that did not align with either Mesopotamian or Anatolian bureaucratic systems. They referenced rulers whose names did not appear in any known king lists. They described treaties with neighbouring powers that should have been documented elsewhere if they had truly existed at the scale implied.
Look at how this foundation
more
trench
strangely,
intersects the earlier
the terminology
post holes.
used suggested
It
a level of
confirms the
administrative
sequence we
centralization
hypothesized
that
for the
rivaled
late
or
Bronze
exceeded
Age
that of
levels.
better-known empires of the second millennium BCE. Still, for a long time, these finds were treated as isolated noise. It was only when multiple excavation teams, working independently across different regions, began reporting similar inconsistencies that the pattern became harder to ignore. Sites in northern Syria, southeastern Anatolia, and parts of the upper Tigris Basin all began to reveal traces of a connected material culture
The doorway
that did
is
not
much
fully belong to
clearer
any
now.
recognised civilization. The implication was unsettling. Either archaeologists were repeatedly misidentifying evidence across multiple sites, or there had once been a political and cultural entity of considerable scale that had not survived in the historical record in any coherent form. What emerged from this growing body of evidence was not a single clear identity, but the outline of
Recording the
something
coordinates
vast
for the
and strangely
Hellenistic pottery
absent.
cluster now.
A superpower in
Noted.
the archaeological
The
sense does not
stratigraphy
need to match
confirms
modern
we are
definitions
still
of
in the
empire.
early Roman
It only
deposits
needs to
here.
demonstrate reach, organisation, and influence across regions and populations. And in that sense, the traces were beginning to suggest something that once operated on a scale comparable to the great powers of the Bronze Age world. Yet it was not named, at least not in the way others were. One of the most intriguing aspects of these findings is how
Charred
often the
timber
material
confirms
evidence
the major
contradicts the
fire
written
we suspected
silence.
at this level.
In neighbouring
And the
civilizations,
pottery style
trade
suggests a
goods from
date
this missing
consistent
power
with the
appear in
late Bronze
inventories.
Age collapse.
Foreign goods are recorded in
These
royal tribute
massive
lists.
pithoi
Diplomatic
held the
marriages are
very
implied through
lifeblood
indirect
of the
references.
ancient world.
The originating culture,
Enough
the source of
grain
these
to
goods and
feed
relationships,
thousands.
is often left unnamed or referred to only in vague geographic terms that later historians struggled to map onto any known polity. It creates a paradox, a presence strong enough to be felt, but not preserved in narrative memory. Some scholars argue that this is not unusual. History is often unevenly preserved, shaped by the survival of texts and the political interests of those who produced them. A civilization can exist in full complexity and still leave only faint traces if its records were destroyed, its cities abandoned, or its identity absorbed
See
into
how
later
the carving
powers.
aligns with the
The
third
evidence for this
dynasty.
possibility is well established in other
We need to
contexts.
proceed very
The collapse of the
carefully
Bronze
around
Age,
the
for
entrance.
example, erased entire administrative systems across the eastern Mediterranean, leaving behind fragmented successor states and cultural amnesia. But what makes this case different
Look
is
at
the
this
scale of
section
the
here.
silence relative to the material footprint.
Is that the
In
seal of
certain
the king?
excavation layers, the
It
density of
matches the
settlement patterns
description in
suggests
the
sustained
Gudea
urban
cylinders.
development over centuries. Fortified structures, irrigation systems, and standardized production techniques indicate coordinated planning. Even without written records, the engineering alone implies governance. And yet, when historians attempt to place these sites within known frameworks, they repeatedly encounter gaps that cannot be easily bridged. There are no smooth transitions from this material culture into later dominant civilizations in the way one might expect if assimilation had been gradual and well documented. Instead, there are abrupt discontinuities. Layers of occupation end, New cultural signatures appear above them with little explanation. It is as if something large was not only lost, but
Be
replaced.
extremely careful with
The
that
question
joint.
that begins to
It
form
looks
in
like
the background
oak,
of all this research
maybe
is
a bridge
uncomfortable in its
support.
simplicity. How does something so structurally significant disappear from memory so completely? In some cases, the answer may lie in environmental change. River systems shift, agricultural zones collapse, populations migrate.
According to the scan, the
Entire urban
stratification
networks can
suggests
dissolve
an
within a few
earlier
generations
period
if
right
the
here.
ecological foundation beneath them
Let's
fails.
cross-reference that with the pottery
Geological and climate
fragments we
data from the
found
late Bronze
yesterday.
Age do support periods of severe drought and instability across the region. These pressures likely contributed to widespread social disruption, and no single civilization was immune. Yet environmental collapse alone does not fully account for the pattern of omission seen in later records. Even when societies fall apart, they are usually remembered by those who come after them, even if imperfectly. Names change, stories distort, but complete erasure is rare unless it is reinforced by deliberate cultural or political processes, and that is where the mystery deepens. Because in the scattered references that do survive, there are hints of a civilization that once held enough influence to matter to its neighbours in a fundamental
Log this
way.
ceramic shard
It's
at
not merely as a trading partner
45.2
or rival
east,
city-state,
12.1
it is a
south.
structured power
Got
whose
it.
absence
The
would have
depth
left
is
a
stable
noticeable
at 2
void in the
meters.
balance of the ancient world. Still, that void is exactly what later history presents. As excavation work continues, the feeling that emerges is not simply that of discovery, but of reconstruction under resistance. Every fragment recovered feels like a piece that has been separated from a larger whole, not just by time, but by something more complex. Whether that complexity
reconstruction
comes from
is
deliberate erasure,
painstaking,
cultural absorption,
revealing
or the simple
partial
fragility of
sequences
historical
of a
transmission
language
remains
lost
uncertain.
for millennia.
What survives in the record suggests influence without identity, structure without narrative, presence without recognition. And as more layers are peeled back from the earth, the outline of this hidden superpower becomes harder to dismiss as
Beneath the
coincidence.
rising sun,
It begins to look less
the
like a
ancient
forgotten
city
footnote of
begins to
history,
reveal
and more
its
like a chapter
secrets,
that was removed,
layer by
leaving
layer,
only traces in the margins
offering
where
an
memory was not fully controlled.
Beneath these dunes
The deeper the
lies
excavation
the
trenches
heart
cut
of
into
the
the ancient
residential
soils of the upper river
district,
valleys, the more the
untouched
silence
for
of history
millennia.
begins to feel less like absence and more like resistance. It is not a clean void where nothing once existed, but a layered quiet, the kind that builds up after centuries of sediment burying not just cities, but the memory of their names. Beneath that silence, fragments continue to surface, and with each new discovery, the outline of a forgotten superpower becomes less theoretical and more disturbingly tangible. What first appeared as scattered anomalies now starts to resemble a coherent cultural horizon, stretching across a wide geographical arc. From the foothills of southeastern Anatolia, down into the northern Levant, and eastward toward the upper reaches of Mesopotamia, archaeologists begin
Look
to
at the
recognise
alignment
repeating
here.
patterns in material culture.
It
It
mirrors
is not
the
identical
celestial map we
uniformity,
found earlier.
but something more subtle
Exactly.
shared construction
This
techniques.
changes
Similar
everything.
administrative seals, recurring motifs in pottery design, and standardised weights that suggest coordinated economic systems rather than isolated innovation. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The significance of these patterns does not lie only in their presence, but in their distribution.
Look at the detail on
They do
this
not
vessel.
cluster neatly around a
It
single known
confirms the late
capital or
Bronze
cultural
Age
centre from
context.
later historical maps.
Noted.
Instead,
the spectrometer
they appear as if
reading now.
belonging to a network that once tied multiple regions together under a shared political or administrative logic. Yet no surviving ancient historian clearly names such a network in a way that aligns with what is being uncovered archaeologically. This disconnect between material evidence and written record becomes the central tension driving modern interpretations. On one side, archaeology reveals complexity, scale, and organisation. On the other,
Spanning miles
surviving
across
texts
the
from neighbouring
plateau.
civilizations offer only fragmented,
Look at the
indirect
mortar
references.
difference here.
When they do mention groups that might correspond to this
Yes,
horizon,
that
they do
confirms
so
the 2nd
inconsistently,
century edition we
often using different names
hypothesized.
that do not easily reconcile into a single identity. One of the most striking categories of evidence comes from administrative seals. These small, often overlooked objects were essential to ancient governance.
I have the
They
coordinates for
authenticated
this find.
goods, marked
Good.
ownership, and
Let's
validated official
cross-reference it with the
correspondence.
level 7
Across
dataset
multiple
before we
sites,
proceed.
seals emerge bearing symbols that do not match established iconographic systems of well-documented empires like Egypt, Assyria, or Babylonia. Yet they are not primitive or isolated. They show a mature symbolic language, suggesting a developed bureaucracy with standardized practices. In some cases, these seals are found in contexts associated with trade goods originating
Beneath the
far
shifting
beyond their immediate
dunes lies
excavation
the
sites.
intricate
That implies
craftsmanship
not
of
only
the
production
elite
and administration,
architects,
but long-distance
testament
exchange routes
to a
capable of
forgotten
sustaining
empire.
regular economic interaction. Such systems require more than local authority. They require coordination across regions, enforcement mechanisms, and shared protocols. Still, despite this administrative sophistication, written records remain frustratingly scarce or fragmentary. A few tablets have been recovered, often broken or reused in later construction layers. Their inscriptions partially legible but linguistically ambiguous. Some resemble known languages in structure but diverge in grammar or vocabulary in ways that resist clear classification. Others appear entirely unique, hinting at scripts that may have gone extinct without ever being fully deciphered. This linguistic uncertainty plays a crucial role in the civilization's disappearance from historical memory. Writing systems are among the most durable carriers of identity. When they survive, They anchor
Erosion, a
civilizations
force
in
of
time.
nature,
When they
slowly
vanish,
reveals the
everything attached
foundations
to
of
them
this
becomes
ancient
vulnerable to
temple,
reinterpretation or complete
reclaiming
loss.
history
In this
stone
case,
by stone.
it appears that whatever
Look at
script
the
once unified
standardized
this
weights
culture
here,
either
clearly
fell out of use
indicating
early
a
or was
centralized
never widely
authority.
preserved in durable
And the
form.
layout of these stalls
The absence of a
confirms
stable textual
large-scale
tradition makes the
commerce.
work of reconstruction heavily dependent on material culture. And material culture, while powerful, is inherently interpretive. Pottery style can suggest cultural continuity.
The
or simply
iconography
trade
on these
influence.
Uruk seals
The seal
is
design can
remarkably
indicate
consistent.
administrative identity or artistic
Yes,
borrowing.
and the wear
Even
patterns
settlement
suggest
patterns
they
can be
were
read
in
in
use
multiple
for
ways depending on the
centuries.
broader assumptions applied. Yet even with these limitations, consistency of the evidence across regions continues to challenge simpler explanations. It becomes increasingly difficult to argue that all of these similarities arose independently or through loose cultural diffusion alone. At some point, the density of shared features suggests coordination, if not political unity, then at least sustained integration under a broader system. Some researchers propose that what is being uncovered is not a single centralised empire in the later imperial sense.
The
but
excavation
a
has
loosely
unearthed a
federated system of
collapsed archive,
city-states or regional
revealing
powers
thousands of
bound together by
cuneiform
economic
tablets,
and administrative
partial narrative
frameworks.
sequences
This would help
undisturbed
explain
for
both the
millennia.
presence of shared
The
systems and the
standardized
absence of a
housing
dominant
blocks
capital,
emerging from
clearly
these
remembered
layers
in later traditions.
suggest a level
However,
of coordinated
even this
urban
model struggles
planning
to account for
rarely
the degree of
seen in the ancient
standardization
world.
observed in weights, seals, and architectural planning. One particularly revealing line of evidence comes from urban layouts. In several excavation sites, cities
Pull the tarp
attributed to
down,
this
quickly!
cultural rising exhibit
It's
surprisingly
ripping.
consistent planning
We need more
principles.
weight.
Residential zones,
Watch the pottery, near the
administrative
pillar.
centres, and storage facilities are arranged in ways that suggest prior knowledge of urban organisation rather than organic growth. Roads follow predictable orientations, and defensive structures show similarities in construction logic.
The sheer scale
across
of the
sites separated by
excavation
significant
reveals a
distance.
civilization far
Such
more
uniformity
complex
implies
than
either a shared
previously
cultural
imagined,
blueprint or a strong central
stretching
authority
back
that once
millennia.
disseminated planning
Look at this
standards across
prefix
its
here. It
territories.
changes the
In either
entire
case,
meaning of the verb. So
implication
it's
is
not
the
a
same,
dedication,
level of
it's a
coordination.
warning.
It
We
would
should
normally leave a more
cross-reference this with the
recognisable mark in
pottery from
historical
Grid
records.
7.
And yet, when later civilizations describe the political landscape of the region, this structure is largely absent. Instead, we encounter references to smaller
Look at the
kingdoms,
junction here.
shifting
The
alliances,
stonework is
and
clearly
fragmented
from an earlier
polities.
period.
The impression is of
Yes,
a world that has already
the
been broken into
radiocarbon
pieces
dating
by the
will
time it
confirm
enters
the
the written
transition.
traditions that survive. What preceded that fragmentation is left vague, almost intentionally so in some cases, as if the earlier structure had already become inconvenient or irrelevant to those recording history. This raises an uncomfortable possibility that historians and archaeologists approach with caution, that the disappearance of this superpower from memory may not be purely accidental. Cultural memory is not neutral. It is shaped by what later societies choose to preserve, what they inherit, and what they actively suppress or replace. In the ancient world, new regimes often rewrote histories to legitimize themselves. Conquerors absorbed predecessors, rebranded achievements, and reframed earlier powers
The boundary
as either
here
chaotic or
matches the
insignificant.
shift in the Munsell reading.
This process is well documented
Okay, so the
in
red
several
marker goes
civilizations,
exactly
where
at
royal
42
inscriptions explicitly
centimeters
diminish
below
former
datum.
rulers or erase their contributions altogether. But rarely does such rewriting achieve total erasure across multiple independent sources. And yet, in this case, the silence is unusually widespread. Even in regions where archaeological evidence suggests continuous habitation, cultural transitions appear abrupt in the historical narrative. It is as if the memory of a prior system was either deliberately dismantled or gradually overwritten, until only faint traces remained in the archaeological record. Some scholars cautiously suggest that later dominant powers in the region may have had political or ideological incentives to minimise the legacy of this earlier civilization. Not necessarily
Look
through
at the seal
explicit
impression
destruction of
here. The
records,
disruption was
but through
clearly
gradual
sudden.
absorption of its identity into
Yes,
broader
the
imperial
systemic
narratives.
collapse is
Over
evident in the
generations, things
stratification.
change, boundaries shift,
The
and
sheer
origins
scale
blur
of
until
the
the original structure
excavation
becomes nearly
hints
invisible.
at a civilization
Still,
far
such
more
explanations remain
advanced
partial.
than previously imagined.
Environmental pressures, internal fragmentation, and external invasions likely all played roles in the transformation. No single factor can fully account for the complexity of the disappearance. What remains consistent, however, is the growing recognition that the evidence points towards something far more significant than previously assumed. A structured, interconnected world
The
once
alignment
existed
is
here,
astonishing.
operating at a scale that
This
influenced
wasn't
neighbouring
just a
powers in
settlement.
ways that are still detectable,
It was a planned
even if its own
metropolis
name has not
buried
survived
for
clearly into the
millennia.
present. And as new discoveries continue to emerge from beneath the soil, the question becomes less about whether this superpower existed, and more about how much of its story was lost not in destruction alone, but in the
sill
long,
layer here is
uneven
consistent,
process of
45
historical
centimeters
forgetting.
from the top edge.
Somewhere beneath the
Noted.
broken strata of
The
time,
pottery
where
shards
later
align with the
civilizations
late
built over
Bronze
old
Age
foundations
sequence.
without ever fully realizing what they were covering. Remnants of an administrative world begin to reappear in fragments. Not monuments, not grand inscriptions. The quieter machinery of governance clay tablets hardened
The
by fire.
standardization here
Seal
is
impressions pressed into forgotten
unprecedented.
contracts.
It confirms
Inventory lists that
centralized
once kept a
economic
vast system
control.
running with precision. These are not the artifacts of myth or legend. They are the residue of bureaucracy, and they carry a different kind of weight. What makes them unsettling is not their presence, but their distribution. They are not concentrated in a single archive, carefully preserved like the libraries of Assyria or the temple records of Egypt. Instead, they appear scattered, often broken, reused in a later construction, or buried in destruction layers that suggest deliberate disruption. It is as if someone once tried to ensure that the administrative memory of this civilization would not survive intact. The idea of a vanished royal archive
The
begins to
aerial
take shape
view
not from one
reveals a
discovery,
sophisticated
but from the
network
absence of what should have
connecting
been
these
there.
desert outposts.
In other ancient superpowers,
Evidence
archives
of
are
a
among the most
true
durable
regional
forms
power.
of continuity. Even when cities fall, clay tablets survive in collapsed ruins, baked harder by fire, preserving names, taxes, laws, and correspondence. Entire civilizations can be reconstructed from these remnants alone, but in this case, the expected core of administrative continuity is missing. Instead, archaeologists
Nowhere
find
else on
fragments
Earth
that
can you
hint at
see
something
nearly
once far more
3,000 years of
extensive.
history
A
laid
broken
bare
tablet
like this,
referencing grain
from the
allocations
Roman
across multiple
mosaics down
regions.
to the Bronze Age
A partial list of
foundations.
officials with titles that do not match known bureaucratic systems. A seal impression suggesting authority over distant settlements that have not yet been fully excavated. Each piece implies a larger structure that is no longer visible. The administrative language itself is one of the most intriguing aspects. In several sites, scribal marks appear consistent enough to suggest standardized training, yet they do not fully align with the writing systems of neighboring cultures. There are similarities to early Mesopotamian cuneiform traditions, but also deviations that resist direct classification. Some scholars propose that this may represent an independent evolution of writing, while others suggest it could be a regional variant that was later absorbed or replaced. What remains clear is that literacy, in some structured form, existed at a level sufficient to support complex governance. Tax systems,
Grid
resource
reference Delta
distribution,
4. Confirm
labour
the coordinates for the
organisation,
ceramic
and
cluster.
diplomatic
Confirmed.
correspondence all
Transferring the
require
data
written
now.
administration.
Good. Mark the lithic
And
scatter
yet,
with a yellow
the
flag and
surviving
log it as
textual
feature
record
7.
is so incomplete that the full scope of the system can only be inferred indirectly. One particularly revealing pattern emerges in the reuse of tablets. In multiple excavation contexts, clay documents appear repurposed as construction material, embedded in walls or foundations of later buildings. This practice is not unusual in antiquity, especially during periods of collapse or rebuilding. However, the frequency with which administrative texts from this culture appear in secondary use suggests a systematic disruption, rather than incidental recycling. It raises a difficult question. Were these archives simply abandoned and reused over time, or was there a phase of intentional dismantling?
These
The records were
eroded
broken apart and
structures
dispersed as
hint
part of
at
the
a
broad
once
transformation.
bustling port,
The
now
archaeological
slowly
record cannot answer
reclaimed
this
by the
definitively,
sea.
but the pattern invites comparison with other
Look at the
historical moments
detail
where
on this
conquering powers sought
fragment.
to erase or absorb the administrative identities
It
of previous
confirms
regimes.
the dating we
In
suspected.
some cases, the destruction layers associated with these
This
fragments show signs of
stratification
rapid
confirms
abandonment.
the Hellenistic
Storage
period
rooms filled with
reconstruction
unfinished
right
records,
here above the
administrative
earlier
quarters left
Bronze
in
Age
disarray,
structure.
seal impressions still
Built
attached to broken
centuries
jars,
ago, this
suggesting goods were
intricate
never fully
network
processed.
channeled water
Such details
across
point
the
towards
cracked
sudden
earth,
disruption,
allowing
possibly linked to broader
civilization
regional
to flourish.
instability. Climate data from the Late Bronze Age supports the idea of environmental stress during this period, including prolonged droughts that would have strained agricultural and economic systems. Yet environmental stress alone does not fully explain the fragmentation of the administrative record. Even in times of collapse, ancient societies often leave behind concentrated archives and final moments of preservation. Here, the pattern feels more
sheer
diffuse,
volume
as if the
of
archival system itself was
over-scattered
dismantled
seal
in stages rather than
impressions
destroyed in a
suggests
single
not a gradual
catastrophic
decline.
event. This is where the idea of a vanished royal archive becomes more than metaphor. Some researchers suggest that central repositories may have existed, but were systematically lost through a
Look at the
combination of
consistency
destruction,
of the brickwork here. It
relocation,
suggests a
and
much
later
earlier
reuse of
date.
materials.
Yes, and
If
the
royal or
alignment with
state
the central
archives were written on
plaza
perishable
confirms
materials
its
in addition to
administrative
clay,
function.
such as wood, leather, or parchment-like substances that rarely survive in the archaeological record, then entire layers of administrative memory could have disappeared without leaving traceable evidence. There is also the possibility that later cultures deliberately avoided preserving certain records. In the ancient world, rewriting administrative continuity was sometimes a political necessity. When new dynasties emerged, they often
Here we see
restructured
clear
record-keeping systems to
evidence of an
legitimize their
organised
authority,
organised
selectively
workshop.
preserving or discarding earlier
This
documentation.
excavation reveals
Over time,
a stunning
this process can
timeline,
create the illusion that
with
certain
each
predecessors
layer
were less significant
representing
than
a
they actually
distinct
were.
cultural shift.
Still, even this explanation struggles to fully account for the consistency of absence. The missing archive is not just a single gap in one region's history. It appears across multiple excavation
Calipers
zones,
read
spanning
152
different
millimeters
environmental
on
and
the
cultural
femur.
contexts, yet
Copy
producing a
that.
similar result
Ready
with
for the
scattered
next shot.
administrative remnants without a central core. One of the most compelling pieces of indirect evidence comes from economic standardization. Weight systems recovered from various sites show remarkable consistency over large distances. This suggests a regulated economy, one that would normally require central oversight or at least coordinated regional administration. Trade cannot function at scale without shared measurement systems, and shared systems imply governance structures capable of enforcing them. And yet, the documents that would normally accompany such systems tax records, legal codes, royal decrees are largely missing.
The
or
highly
incomplete.
detailed,
The absence
textured
is especially
surfaces
striking when
reveal the
compared to neighbouring
dramatic effects of
civilizations,
time.
where administrative
as these
documentation is
in-
abundant and often meticulously preserved. This imbalance forces a reconsideration of what kind of political structure might have existed. It's possible that the system was more decentralized than later empires, relying on local administration bound together by economic or cultural agreements, rather than strict centralized control. Such systems can leave
This
fewer
cluster
durable
here
records,
near the east wall, it
especially
doesn't
if
fit
written
the pattern.
documentation was
Unless
not
the entire
consistently
structure
archived.
oriented north
But even
by this
decentralized
angle.
systems tend
That
to leave clearer
explains the
traces of
density here.
continuity than what is observed here. Another line of inquiry focuses on the role of conflict. Warfare can disrupt administrative systems rapidly, especially if key centres of record-keeping are destroyed. Archaeological layers in some regions do show evidence of violent destruction, including burned structures and collapsed storage facilities. However, these events are not uniformly
high
distributed,
concentrations
and
of
they do not fully
domestic
align with
pottery
the scale
right
of
alongside
administrative
the
disappearance
grinding
suggested
stone
by the
here.
fragments.
It clearly
What
defines
emerges
the living
instead is a more
space.
complex picture of gradual fragmentation. Parts of the system appear to survive in isolated contexts, while others vanish entirely. Over time, continuity breaks down, and later, cultures inherit only partial knowledge of what once existed. In this fragmented inheritance, the idea of a royal archive becomes symbolic of something larger.
Look
the
at how
vulnerability of
precise this
administrative
corner
memory
is.
itself.
It matches
Without
the northern
continuous
quadrant
preservation,
exactly.
Even the most sophisticated
The
systems can
standardization
dissolve into
is
irretrievable
remarkable.
fragments. And once that happens, reconstruction becomes an exercise in inference rather than documentation. What survives today is not the archive itself, but its shadow, a scattered collection of references, broken records, and indirect echoes preserved in neighbouring civilizations that interacted with it but did not fully record its internal structure. As excavation continues, each new fragment adds clarity to specific aspects of governance, yet simultaneously deepens the sense that the complete system will never be fully recovered. The archive was not simply lost in time, it was dispersed, overwritten, and partially erased in ways that still resist full explanation. And in that absence, the outline of the
I believe this
superpower becomes
piece
both more
slots in
visible and
just
more
here.
elusive,
Yes,
as if
the
it
text
exists
seems
only in
to
the
flow
negative space
correctly
left behind
now.
by its own disappearance.
Check the reverse
Across
side
the ancient
markings.
landscape of the Near East, the rivers once carved lifelines through arid plains and mountain passes, connected worlds that now feel distant and fragmented. There are faint traces of political relationships.
The
that
scale
should
of
have
this
been recorded
furnace
far more
indicates
clearly than they
production
are.
far beyond
The
the
deeper
local
researchers
need.
look into
And the
diplomatic
slag
history,
deposits
the
are
more they encounter a strange
unprecedented.
imbalance.
We must
Some
proceed with
civilizations speak
caution.
loudly of themselves and their neighbours, listing alliances, wars, tributes, marriages in careful detail. Others appear only in passing references.
Look
as
at
if they
this
were
pattern
important
here
enough
on
to be
the rim.
Yes,
acknowledged, but
it
not
matches
important
the
enough to be
design on the
preserved in
bronze
memory.
seal we found
It is
yesterday.
within this imbalance
Make
that
a
the
note of
idea
the
of allies
correlation.
written out of history begins to take shape.
The relentless
In the
current
conventional
of the
narrative of the
delta
Bronze
preserved
Age,
this
power is
site,
usually attributed to
a
a few
testament
dominant
to
centres.
those who built
Egypt,
upon the water's
with its
edge.
monumental inscriptions and carefully curated royal records. Mesopotamia, with its dense bureaucratic archives. The Hittite Empire, which emerged later but left behind treaties and diplomatic correspondence that reveal a complex international system. These powers are well represented in both archaeological and textual records, but between and alongside them, there are hints of other political entities whose presence is undeniable in trade and interaction, yet strangely muted in historical description.
Look,
Before
I think
go
we have
deeper,
a clear lithic
take a moment
scatter
to like
here.
the video and
Maybe
subscribe.
early Bronze
If
Age.
this is the kind of
Noted.
history and mystery you
Coordinates
enjoy,
logged. Let's
some of
get
the
some
most
close-ups
intriguing
before
evidence
the
comes
light
from
shifts.
diplomatic correspondence
These
discovered
massive
in royal
pithoi,
archives of better
partially
documented
buried in the
civilizations.
packed earth,
These
are
letters,
clear
often written
evidence
in
of a
Akkadian
highly
as lingua franca of the
organized
time,
Bronze Age
reference
economy.
foreign rulers,
Look
trade
at the way
agreements,
they've
and
interlocked the
military
masonry
coalitions.
here.
Yet in several
This
cases,
changes
names
everything
and
we
titles
thought
used
we
for certain
knew about
counterparts
their
do not
engineering
correspond neatly
capabilities.
to any known political entities in later historical reconstructions. Instead, they appear as regional designations or generalized terms that may conceal a more structured and powerful civilization behind vague
The
labeling.
lifeblood of the ancient
This pattern
world
raises an
flowed
important
along
question.
these
Were
routes,
these references
linking
deliberately
distant
precise,
cities and
or did later
cultures
historians
across
simply
the
lose
unforgiving
context needed to
landscape.
interpret them correctly?
This tablet here
One example
details
lies
the
in the way
monthly
certain
grain
trade goods are described.
allocations.
Texts
The
from
entire
Egyptian and
administrative
Mesopotamian sources
system
mention
seems to have
high-quality
collapsed
materials
overnight.
arriving from regions that are clearly significant but not always clearly defined. Timber from the north, metals from mountainous regions, textiles of unusual quality from inland centres.
Look at the
These
mortar
descriptions
here.
imply a network
This
of exchange
confirms
that
the
spans
second
multiple
repair
ecological
phase we
zones,
hypothesized.
suggesting
Got
the
it. The
existence of a
Phoenician layer,
coordinated
correct.
system capable of managing long-distance trade routes across diverse terrains. Yet the source of this network often remains unnamed or only partially identified. Archaeologically, this is supported by the widespread distribution of standardized goods that appear across multiple sites, similar ceramics, consistent metallurgical techniques, and shared stylistic motifs in artifacts suggest that these regions were not isolated but integrated into a broader economic and cultural system. In some cases, the same types of administrative seals appear far from their presumed point of origin, indicating controlled movement of goods and official oversight. This level of integration is difficult to explain without some form of political or administrative
Look, the
coordination.
grain merchant seal.
Trade alone rarely
It connects
produces
right
such
here.
consistency over large
Incredible.
distances, unless
That
it is supported
confirms
by
the northern
agreements,
trade route.
regulations, or shared governance
This inscription
structures.
changes
And yet,
everything we
the
thought
textual
about the
record that would
administrative
normally
core.
accompany such systems is
The
fragmented or
dating
absent.
suggests it's
In
even
some
older
instances,
than the palace
foreign
structure.
rulers describe alliances
The
that appear
sheer
unusually
scale of
balanced,
this
rather than
interconnected
the typical
system
language of tribute and
suggests a
subordination
major
found in many
hub of
ancient
trade
imperial
and
records.
culture in the
These
ancient
texts
world.
sometimes suggest relationships between powers of comparable status, diplomatic marriages, treaty agreements, and mutual obligations hint at a multipolar world rather than a strictly hierarchical one. The civilization at the centre of this network, the one that seems to appear in material evidence but not in narrative dominance, remains elusive. One of the more subtle indicators
We
of this missing
finally have
presence comes from the
definitive
absence
proof
of conflict
that this
narratives.
complex was built
Ancient empires
directly
often
upon
define
the
themselves
sacred
through war.
foundations of the previous
Victories are recorded in
civilization.
detail, enemies are named, and defeated peoples are described with emphasis. Yet in the regions associated with this forgotten superpower, Later records do not consistently describe conquest,
The beads
in the
are
way one might
definitely
expect if
lapis.
a major rival had been decisively defeated.
And the skeleton appears
Instead,
mostly intact,
there is a kind of
except for the
narrative
left
silence.
femur.
Not a dramatic destruction
This
account,
sophisticated
but an
network
absence
of
of
trade
sustained
routes was
reference.
the lifeblood of
It is
the
as if
ancient
the political
world,
entity simply
connecting
fades from
distant
diplomatic
cities and
awareness,
ensuring the
rather
flow
than
of
being
goods and
explicitly
power.
overthrown.
These
This is
submerged
unusual,
structures
even
offer a
when
glimpse
civilizations
into the
collapse
harbor's
due to internal
past,
instability or
preserved
environmental
by the
pressure.
very
Neighbouring
sediments that
states tend
buried
to
them.
record at least some account of their downfall. The lack of such documentation in this case suggests either that records were lost, or that later powers had little incentive to preserve or emphasise the identity of this earlier system.
The erosion here is
Some scholars
significant.
propose that this silence
We
may
might
be the
lose
result
this
of
line.
gradual absorption.
Yes,
Rather
but the
than a
sequence
single
confirms
conquest
the
event,
dating we
the
discussed.
civilization may have been integrated piece by piece into surrounding political structures. Administrative elites could have been absorbed into new regimes. Trade systems rebranded under different authorities.
As the sun
and
dipped
regional
below the
identities
horizon,
gradually overwritten.
the true
Over
scale
generations,
of this discovery
the original
begins
political
to
identity would
emerge from
dissolve
the
without a
shifting
clear moment of
sands.
disappearance.
The
This
distribution
process
ends
is
right
well
here, at the
documented in
contour
other
line.
historical
But this
contexts.
cluster
The
suggests
cultural
an earlier
assimilation
phase.
replaces overt
We
destruction
need to verify
as
the
the primary
context of
mechanism
the
of
copper
change.
fragments.
However, even in cases of assimilation, traces of the original system usually persist more clearly in written traditions. Here, the persistence is weak, fragmented, and often ambiguous. Another line of evidence comes from the way neighbouring civilizations describe geography. Certain regions are consistently referenced as economically important.
This is
but
clearly the
politically
main
vague.
hearth for
They're
the
described in
domestic
terms
area.
of resources, not governance.
And look at this
This
pottery,
suggests that while the
it's
land and its
remarkably
production were well known,
intact.
the political identity of its controlling system may not have been consistently recognised or recorded. This could indicate a decentralised structure, where authority was distributed among multiple centres rather than
Look at this
concentrated
one,
in a
it's
single
perfectly
capital.
preserved.
Such systems are harder to describe
The
in
detail
imperial
on the
narratives,
seal is
which
sharp.
tend to favour clear hierarchies and identifiable rulers. Alternatively, it could reflect a deliberate simplification by later scribes who chose to categorise complex
Emerging
political
from
realities
the dust
into
of
more manageable
centuries,
terms.
The city
The archaeological
grid
record adds another layer of complexity. In some excavation zones, evidence of cultural continuity suggests long-term stability, while in others, sudden shifts in material culture indicate rapid transformation. These inconsistencies make it difficult to construct a single unified model of political development. What remains consistent, however, is the presence of interaction. This was not an isolated world. Goods, ideas, technologies, and administrative practices moved across regions with surprising fluidity. The question is not whether this superpower existed in isolation, but how it fit into a broader system of interdependent civilizations. And yet, despite this interconnection, its identity remains blurred. One particularly intriguing possibility is that later empires may have had strategic reasons to downplay the significance of this earlier power. In the ancient world, legitimacy was often built by controlling historical narrative. By emphasizing continuity from certain predecessors while minimizing others, ruling powers could shape perceptions of rightful authority. If this forgotten superpower represented an alternative model of organization or an earlier source of influence, it may have been gradually excluded from official histories. But even this explanation cannot fully resolve the inconsistency between material evidence and textual silence, because the artifacts remain, the seals, the trade goods, the standardized systems of measurement, and the architectural similarities all point toward a civilization that was not minor, not marginal, but structurally significant. And in that contradiction lies the heart of the mystery, a civilization that once shaped networks of exchange and influence across vast regions, yet survives in historical memory only as scattered references and indirect echoes. The allies it once had are still visible in the archaeological record. The relationships it maintained are still traceable in diplomatic fragments, but its own name, its own voice, is largely missing from the stories that survived. What remains is a world that remembers its connections, but not always the central presence that made those connections meaningful. And as more evidence is uncovered, the sense grows stronger that this is not merely a gap in knowledge, but a structural absence in the way history itself was recorded and preserved. In the long corridors of ancient memory, there are moments when silence itself becomes evidence. Not the silence of a single ruined city or a forgotten battle, but a broader, more structured absence that stretches across entire historical narratives. When researchers compare the surviving records of the late Bronze Age civilizations, they expect overlap shared references, mutual recognition, and at least occasional acknowledgement of major regional powers. Instead, they encounter something more unsettling, a consistent gap where a major political presence should have been unmistakably visible. This is the great silence in records, and it is one of the most debated aspects of the vanished superpower. The issue is not that ancient sources are incomplete. They always are. The issue is proportionality. Egypt, for example, leaves behind extensive inscriptions describing not only its own achievements, but also its interactions with foreign lands. Mesopotamian archives preserve detailed lists of kings, cities, and diplomatic exchanges stretching across centuries. Even smaller polities often find themselves referenced in relation to these dominant centres. But in the regions associated with this mysterious cultural horizon, the expected density of references collapses into sporadic, inconsistent mentions. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Some texts refer to powerful groups in the north or inland regions, but the descriptions are often vague, using geographic generalizations rather than clear political identification. Terms like highland peoples or distant rulers appear repeatedly, as if the scribes were aware of a presence but either lacked precise terminology or chose not to preserve it. In other cases, names appear only once or twice in surviving corpora, never repeated with the consistency expected of major international actors. This pattern becomes more significant when viewed against the background of trade and material exchange. Archaeological evidence shows that goods from this unidentified cultural sphere were widely distributed. Metals, ceramics, and administrative objects appear in contexts far beyond their point of origin. Such distribution implies sustained interaction over time, not isolated contact, and sustained interaction, in the ancient world, almost always generates textual documentation. Yet here, the documentation is strangely thin. One explanation is that records once existed but were lost due to the fragility of ancient writing materials. Not everything was inscribed on clay or stone. Many administrative systems likely relied on organic materials that do not survive in most archaeological conditions. If a civilization depended heavily on such media, its documentary footprint could vanish almost entirely, leaving only indirect traces in durable artifacts. But this explanation only partially resolves the issue. Even when written records are lost, civilizations typically leave secondary references in the archives of others. Neighbouring powers tend to preserve at least some acknowledgement of major trade partners or rivals. The complete reduction of a significant political entity to fragmentary and inconsistent references remains unusual. Another factor to consider is translation and interpretation. Ancient scribes often used exonyms names given to foreign peoples that do not correspond to their self-identified terms. Over time, these exonyms can become distorted, merged, or misunderstood by later historians. It is possible that multiple references across different cultures actually point to the same civilization, but under different labels that were never properly unified in modern scholarship. If this is the case, then the Great Silence is not absolute absence, but fragmentation of identity across linguistic boundaries. Still, even when these possibilities are accounted for, the imbalance persists. The civilizations of the Late Bronze Age were deeply interconnected. Diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and the Hittites, for example, is well preserved and reveals a sophisticated international system of treaties and alliances. Within this system, one would expect a major regional power to appear frequently, either as ally, rival, or intermediary. Instead, what emerges is a strangely peripheral presence. In some cases, this absence becomes more striking when specific historical events are reconstructed. Military campaigns that involved multiple powers often leave overlapping records. If a major player were involved, it would typically appear in at least one of the narrative traditions. But in certain reconstructed events where material evidence suggests large-scale coordination or conflict across regions, the corresponding textual confirmation is either minimal or entirely absent. This disconnect has led some researchers to propose that parts of the historical record may have been selectively preserved, not necessarily through deliberate censorship in a modern sense, but through processes of cultural prioritization. Ancient scribes recorded what mattered most to their patrons. If a later dominant power did not recognize the importance of a predecessor, the predecessor's role could be reduced, simplified, or reframed until it became nearly invisible. This is especially relevant in periods of political transition. When new empires emerge, they often reshape historical narratives to emphasize continuity with certain approved lineages while minimizing or excluding others. Over generations, this selective memory can become embedded in the written tradition itself. However, even selective preservation has limits. It rarely produces complete erasure of a significant actor across multiple independent cultures. Yet in this case, the absence is unusually consistent across different textual traditions, which complicates the argument for simple political rewriting. Archaeology introduces another dimension to the problem. In some regions, settlement patterns suggest long-term stability and dense occupation, indicating a sustained population with organized infrastructure. Yet the corresponding historical narratives do not always reflect this stability. Instead, they present a simplified picture of fragmented polities or shifting tribal groups. This mismatch suggests that the complexity of the real political landscape may have been reduced in transmission. Whether through loss of records, reinterpretation, or deliberate simplification, the end result is the same: a flattened historical memory that no longer reflects the full structure of the ancient world. One of the more subtle clues comes from continuity in craftsmanship. Certain technological traditions, such as metallurgy and pottery production, show clear lines of development that span multiple regions. These traditions often persist even when political identities shift. This indicates that while governments may rise and fall, cultural and technical systems can endure beneath them. If a superpower once coordinated these systems, its influence might still be embedded in the underlying structures of production and exchange, even if its political identity has faded. Yet this raises another question: why does its identity not persist alongside its influence? Some scholars suggest that identity in the ancient world was more fluid than modern assumptions allow. Political entities may not have been perceived as fixed, singular states, but rather as overlapping networks of authority, allegiance, and economic integration. In such a framework, the disappearance of a single name does not necessarily indicate the disappearance of the system itself, only its reconfiguration into new forms. If this is true, then the superpower was not destroyed in a traditional sense. It was transformed, absorbed, and redistributed across successor systems until its original identity ceased to be meaningful. But even this interpretation leaves unanswered the question of why its memory was not preserved more clearly. Civilizations often remember foundational predecessors, even when they evolve beyond them. Here, the memory is faint, inconsistent, and often indirect. What survives instead are echoes, trade goods without origin stories, administrative systems without clear founders, and diplomatic references that point towards something larger than what is explicitly named. The Great Silence, then, is not a void, but a distortion, a historical lens shaped by loss, reinterpretation, and selective survival. It does not indicate that nothing existed, but that what did exist has been filtered through layers of cultural transformation. And as more evidence is uncovered, the silence becomes more difficult to interpret as coincidence. It begins to resemble a pattern one that suggests not just forgotten history, but a history that was gradually unmade in the telling. In the dust-filled corridors of archives long buried beneath later cities, a different kind of discovery begins to emerge, one that does not speak through monuments or ruins, but through correspondence. Clay tablets, broken seals, and fragmentary inscriptions start to reveal something unexpected, a world once bound together not only by trade and conflict, but by communication dense enough to suggest a structured diplomatic system spanning multiple regions. It is in these scattered records that the idea of a forgotten diplomatic network takes shape, even if its central actor remains frustratingly unnamed. What becomes immediately apparent is that ancient diplomacy was far more sophisticated than earlier historians assumed. The image of isolated kingdoms occasionally exchanging gifts or waging wars is replaced by something more intricate. Letters travel across vast distances, treaties are negotiated over long periods, hostages, marriages, and trade agreements bind rulers together in complex webs of obligation. And within this system, one presence appears repeatedly in indirect ways, even when its identity is never fully anchored in the surviving texts. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Some of the most revealing documents come from well-preserved royal archives in neighbouring civilizations. These archives, particularly those of Egypt and the Hittite Empire, contain correspondence written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time. Within these letters, foreign rulers address each other with formal titles, negotiate borders, request resources, and discuss military alliances. The level of detail suggests a stable international system rather than sporadic contact between isolated states. Yet amid this structured diplomacy, certain correspondents appear only in partial form. Their identities are reduced to geographic descriptors, vague titles, or references that do not align cleanly with known political entities. Instead of a clearly defined kingdom with a recognizable capital or dynasty, some partners are described in terms that suggest regional authority without explicit naming. This is not unusual in itself. Ancient scribes often used shorthand when referring to foreign powers, especially when translating complex political realities into their own administrative frameworks. However, the frequency and consistency of these vague references in specific regions raises deeper questions. It suggests that a major actor may have been systematically referred to in ways that obscured its internal structure or political identity. One particularly striking pattern involves treaties that imply parity between rulers. In several well-documented cases, powerful kings from Egypt and the Hittite Empire engage in negotiations that assume mutual recognition of authority. Within these exchanges, references are made to other powers whose status appears comparable, yet whose names are either absent or inconsistently recorded. These missing identities form a gap within the diplomatic map of the ancient world. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that such a gap should not exist. The distribution of goods, architectural similarities, and administrative tools across regions indicate the presence of a highly organized system of exchange. Standardized weights and measures appear across vast distances, suggesting regulatory coordination. Seals and administrative marks imply official oversight. These are not the signs of loose, informal trade networks. They point toward structured economic integration. And yet, the diplomatic record fails to consistently name the authority behind this system. One possible explanation is that we are dealing with a multilingual problem. In the ancient world, political entities often had multiple names depending on the language and perspective of the observer. A single kingdom might be known by different names in Egyptian, Hittite, Akkadian, or local dialects. Over time, these variations can fragment historical identity, making it difficult for modern scholars to unify references into a single coherent entity. If this is the case, then the forgotten superpower may not be absent from the record, but dispersed across linguistic boundaries, hidden in plain sight under multiple identities that were never fully reconciled. However, even when attempting such reconciliations, the evidence remains incomplete. Some references resist alignment entirely, suggesting that they may not simply be alternative names for known civilizations, but indicators of a distinct political structure that does not correspond neatly to any later recognized state. The structure of the diplomatic network itself offers additional clues. Certain letters imply intermediary roles played by smaller polities, suggesting that communication between major powers was sometimes filtered through regional authorities. This indicates a layered system of diplomacy, where influence extended beyond direct contact and into broader regional coordination. In such a system, a central power could exert influence not through direct rule, but through economic dominance, administrative standardization, or cultural integration. If this was the case, its political identity might not always appear prominently in diplomatic correspondence, even if its influence was deeply embedded in the system itself. There is also evidence of shifting terminology over time. Names used to describe regions or rulers change subtly across different periods, even when referring to similar geographic areas. This suggests that political realities were fluid, and that scribes adapted their terminology to reflect changing power dynamics, alliances, or administrative structures. Within this fluidity, it becomes possible for a major power to gradually lose its distinct identity in written records, especially if it underwent transformation rather than abrupt collapse. If its administrative structures were absorbed into neighbouring systems, its diplomatic presence could diminish without a single moment of documented disappearance. Some scholars have proposed that what we are observing is not the absence of a civilization, but the gradual dissolution of its distinct political identity into a broader regional system. In such a scenario, the superpower does not vanish through destruction but through integration. Its institutions persist, its influence continues, but its name fades from diplomatic memory. Yet this interpretation does not fully resolve the imbalance between material and textual evidence. The archaeological record suggests a level of coordination that exceeds what would typically emerge from loosely connected regional systems. The consistency of administrative tools, economic standards, and urban planning across wide areas implies a degree of central influence that is difficult to explain without some form of coordinating authority. And still, that authority remains largely invisible in the surviving diplomatic texts. This tension between visibility and invisibility becomes even more pronounced when examining trade records. Goods move across regions with remarkable regularity. Timber, metals, textiles, and luxury items appear in contexts far from their origin. Trade routes are implied, sometimes even described, but the governing structures behind these routes are rarely named with precision. It is as if the system itself is visible, but its architect is missing. One of the more intriguing possibilities is that the diplomatic network was intentionally structured to decentralize recognition. Authority may have been distributed across multiple centers to prevent any single identity from dominating the narrative. In such a system, the superpower would exist not as a singular named entity, but as a coordinated network of interdependent regions. If so, its absence from historical memory may not be accidental, but structural. A system designed to function without a singular focal identity would naturally resist preservation in narrative form. Still, even this idea struggles to fully account for the degree of silence observed in later historical traditions. Civilizations rarely vanish from memory entirely if they played significant roles in regional diplomacy. Some trace, however distorted, usually survives. What remains in this case are fragments that point toward influence without anchoring it to a stable identity. Diplomatic references that imply power, trade systems that imply coordination, archaeological patterns that imply structure, but no consistent narrative that ties these elements together into a single recognized civilization. And so the diplomatic network becomes both evidence and enigma. It reveals a world far more interconnected than once assumed, yet simultaneously obscures the central presence that may have helped shape that interconnectedness. The more carefully the fragments are studied, the more they suggest that what is missing is not interaction, but recognition. A superpower that once operated at the heart of a vast system, now reduced to echoes scattered across foreign archives. And in that scattering, the question deepens rather than resolves whether this absence is the result of loss, transformation, or something more deliberate embedded in the way ancient memory itself was constructed and preserved. In the fractured landscapes of the ancient Near East, where cities rise and fall across layers of ash, brick, and forgotten rebuilding, there are moments when destruction does not look like the end of a story, but like a deliberate interruption. Entire urban districts appear abandoned in haste, storage rooms are sealed mid-process, administrative tools are left exactly where they were last used, and beneath these disruptions, archaeologists begin to ask a difficult question that cannot be answered by material evidence alone. Was this disappearance the result of collapse, conquest, or something closer to intentional erasure? This is where the debate over destruction versus deliberate rewriting of history begins to take shape, and it sits at the centre of the mystery surrounding the ancient superpower that seems to have vanished from collective memory. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In many well-documented ancient collapses, destruction leaves a clear signature. Fire spreads through cities. Defensive structures show signs of siege. Mass graves or weapon distributions indicate conflict. Even in cases of rapid abandonment, such as environmental disasters, the archaeological record typically preserves a recognizable sequence of final occupation layers. But in the regions associated with this elusive civilization, the pattern is inconsistent. Some sites show clear destruction events, while others appear to transition into new cultural phases without obvious catastrophe. This unevenness is important. It suggests that no single mechanism explains the disappearance of this political and cultural system. Instead, multiple overlapping processes may have been at work, each affecting different regions in different ways. Environmental stress, migration, internal fragmentation, and external pressure all likely contributed. But none of these factors alone can fully account for the systematic reduction of a once integrated system into scattered remnants. One of the most puzzling aspects is the selective nature of destruction layers. In some excavation sites, administrative centres appear heavily affected, while nearby residential zones show continuity. In others, elite structures are abandoned while lower density settlements persist, this pattern does not resemble uniform collapse. It resembles disruption targeted at specific nodes within a larger system. Such targeting could be the result of warfare. Conquering powers often prioritize administrative and symbolic centers to dismantle governance structures. Destroying archives, palaces, and temples can effectively erase institutional memory. However, the distribution of destruction in this case does not always align neatly with known military campaigns from neighbouring civilizations. This has led some researchers to consider a more complex possibility that destruction may have been followed by systematic reorganization rather than simple replacement. In such a scenario, new powers emerging in the region would not only occupy former territories but also reshape the cultural and administrative landscape in ways that overwrite earlier identities. In the ancient world, conquest was often followed by assimilation. Victorious powers absorbed skilled labour, administrative practices, and even religious traditions from the societies they conquered. Over time, this process could blur the distinctions between predecessor and successor states. However, what makes this case unusual is the depth of the disappearance. It is not just political identity that fades, but the coherence of the entire system across multiple domains. Some scholars propose that what we are seeing is a form of historical compression. As new empires rose to dominance, they inherited fragments of earlier systems and integrated them into their own structures, while discarding elements that did not serve their narrative or administrative needs. Over generations, this selective inheritance could produce a distorted historical record in which certain predecessors are emphasized, while others are minimized or omitted entirely. Yet even this explanation struggles to fully account for the archaeological consistency of the underlying system. The material culture associated with this forgotten superpower does not behave like isolated remnants of multiple small polities. Instead, it shows signs of coordination across wide geographic areas, suggesting that it once functioned as a coherent system rather than a loose aggregation of local traditions. This brings attention back to the idea of intentional erasure, though not necessarily in the simplistic sense of deliberate destruction of records. Instead, erasure in antiquity can take many forms. It can occur through the destruction of archives, but also through the renaming of cities, the reattribution of achievements, and the gradual replacement of older administrative frameworks with new ones that render previous identities obsolete. One of the most subtle mechanisms of historical erasure is reinterpretation. When later scribes encounter remnants of earlier systems, they may reinterpret them through the lens of their own cultural and political assumptions. A former administrative title might be recast as a local designation, a foreign ruler might be absorbed into mythological frameworks, entire systems of governance can be reframed as tributary or peripheral, even if they were once central. Over time, these reinterpretations accumulate. What begins as adjustment becomes transformation, and what begins as transformation becomes forgetting. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that cultural transition in this region was not uniform. In some areas, continuity is visible in pottery styles, architectural methods, and agricultural practices. In others, abrupt shifts suggest either population replacement or rapid cultural assimilation. The uneven nature of this transition makes it difficult to reconstruct a single, unified narrative of decline. There is also the possibility that memory itself was stratified. Elite historical records tend to preserve the perspectives of ruling classes, while the experiences of subordinate or transitional groups are often underrepresented. If the superpower in question underwent internal fragmentation before its disappearance from external records, different parts of its former territory may have experienced very different historical trajectories. In such a scenario, later civilizations would inherit not a single coherent memory of the past, but fragmented regional perspectives that do not align into a unified historical identity. One particularly compelling line of evidence comes from the absence of commemorative continuity. Ancient civilizations often preserve memory of predecessors through monumental inscriptions, genealogical claims, or mythological integration. Even when they conquer or replace earlier systems, they tend to acknowledge them in some form, whether as ancestors, rivals, or symbolic figures. In this case, such continuity is weak or inconsistent. Where one might expect structured memory of a major predecessor, there are instead vague references, generalized categories, or complete silence. This raises the possibility that the process was not simply one of destruction or assimilation, but of narrative restructuring on a broader scale. As political landscapes shifted, the importance of certain historical identities may have diminished to the point where they were no longer relevant to the needs of later societies. Once that happens, memory is not actively preserved, and over time, it fades. Another factor to consider is the role of environmental disruption in accelerating these processes. Climate instability during the Late Bronze Age is well documented, with evidence of drought, agricultural stress, and population movement across multiple regions. Such conditions can destabilize political systems rapidly, especially those dependent on complex administrative coordination. However, environmental collapse tends to leave visible scars in the historical record, often accompanied by migration narratives, famine accounts, or reconstruction efforts. While some of these elements are present, they do not fully align with the scale of disappearance suggested by the archaeological anomalies. What emerges instead is a layered process. Environmental stress weakens systems, political fragmentation accelerates change, external powers fill the vacuum, and over time, historical memory is reshaped to reflect the new order rather than the old complexity. In this layered process, The original system does not disappear in a single moment. It dissolves across multiple dimensions: political, administrative, cultural, and narrative, each contributing to the gradual fading of its identity. The result is a historical landscape in which the superpower exists only indirectly. Its influence is embedded in systems that survived it. Its infrastructure is reused by successors. Its technologies are adopted and adapted, but its name, its internal structure, and its narrative coherence are largely absent. And so the question shifts once again, not whether it was destroyed, but how many different processes were required to reduce something so structurally significant to a set of fragmented traces scattered across time. Because what survives is not absence, but transformation without recognition. A system once visible, now hidden not by concealment alone, but by the long, uneven rewriting of history itself. In the shadowed space between conquest and memory, ancient history often becomes less a record of what happened, and more a record of what later powers needed to be true. Empires do not simply inherit the past, they reorganize it. They compress complexity into narratives that serve legitimacy, identity, and control. Within this process, entire civilizations can be reshaped into simplified versions of themselves, or reduced so far that only fragments remain recognizable. It is in this tension that the idea of competing kings and propaganda begins to take center stage in the story of the vanished superpower. The archaeological record alone cannot fully explain why a civilization with such clear material influence appears so faint in surviving historical narratives. To understand that, it becomes necessary to step into the world of ancient political storytelling, where kings did not merely rule territories, but actively shaped the memory of those territories through inscriptions, monuments, and curated histories. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In Egypt, royal inscriptions often present a carefully constructed vision of reality. Pharaohs describe victories in absolute terms, enemies in generalized language, and political order as divinely sanctioned continuity. In Mesopotamia, kings' lists and annals similarly emphasize legitimacy through selective remembrance, highlighting certain rulers while minimizing or omitting others who do not fit later dynastic narratives. This is not unusual. It reflects a broader ancient practice where history was not separate from power, but an extension of it. When this framework is applied to the mystery of the forgotten superpower, a troubling possibility emerges. If later dominant civilizations encountered an earlier political system that did not align with their ideological or dynastic frameworks, they may have had strong incentives to reinterpret, diminish, or absorb its legacy into more manageable categories. This does not necessarily imply deliberate destruction of records in a modern sense. Instead, it suggests a gradual process of narrative restructuring. Names change, boundaries are redefined. Former rulers are recast as local governors, tributary figures, or even mythological predecessors. Over time, what was once a distinct political identity becomes indistinguishable from the background of regional history. Evidence for this kind of transformation appears in the inconsistent way certain regions are described across different textual traditions. A place that appears as a major administrative centre in one set of records may appear as a peripheral or ambiguous region in another. Rulers who are clearly independent in one context are sometimes reframed as subordinate in later accounts. These inconsistencies are not random, they often reflect shifts in political dominance and historiographical control. One of the most important aspects of ancient propaganda is not what it invents, but what it simplifies. Complexity is often the first casualty of political narrative. Multi-centred systems, federations, and overlapping authorities are difficult to represent in royal inscriptions, which tend to favour clear hierarchies and singular authority figures. If the forgotten superpower operated as a complex network rather than a centralised empire, it would have been especially vulnerable to this kind of narrative compression. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that the ancient Near East was not a simple landscape of competing empires, but a deeply interconnected system of overlapping jurisdictions, trade networks, and cultural zones. Within such a system, political identity may not have been fixed in the way later historians assumed. Instead, authority could have been distributed across cities, regions, and institutions in ways that do not translate easily into the language of later imperial records. This creates a structural mismatch between how the ancient world functioned and how it was later recorded. In some cases, competing kingship narratives appear to actively overwrite earlier political realities. When a new dynasty rises, it often redefines the historical landscape to emphasize its own legitimacy. Previous powers are recast as chaotic predecessors, minor rivals, or even as part of a distant, almost mythic past. Over generations, this reframing can significantly distort the memory of earlier systems. The implications for the vanished superpower are significant. If it existed as a dominant or semi-dominant system before being absorbed into later political structures, its identity may have been systematically reframed by successor states to reduce its perceived importance, not necessarily through coordinated conspiracy, but through repeated acts of selective storytelling embedded in official records. One particularly revealing pattern appears in royal inscriptions that describe the establishment of order. New rulers often portray themselves as restorers of stability after a period of chaos. However, what is described as chaos in these texts may, in some cases, correspond to the fragmentation of earlier organised systems. What one regime calls disorder may in fact be the remnants of a more complex predecessor that no longer fits the narrative needs of the present. This reinterpretation of the past is not unique to one civilization. It is a recurring feature of ancient historiography. But in this case, the scale of the missing system makes the effect far more pronounced. A civilization that once influenced trade, diplomacy, and administrative standards across multiple regions would leave behind traces that are difficult to fully erase. Yet in surviving narratives, its presence is often reduced to indirect references or generalized categories. Another dimension of this issue lies in the survival of local histories. Smaller regions often preserve alternative versions of events that differ from imperial accounts. These local traditions can sometimes retain echoes of older political structures that are absent from official records. However, over time, even these traditions tend to be absorbed into broader cultural frameworks, losing their specificity. In the absence of a unified record, historians are left to reconstruct the past through overlapping fragments that do not always align. This creates a situation where multiple partial histories coexist, each preserving a different aspect of reality, but uncapturing the full structure of what once existed. The archaeological record, in contrast, does not participate in narrative simplification. It preserves complexity without interpretation. Administrative tools, architectural systems, and economic standardization all point towards structured organization, yet without accompanying texts, this structure remains partially obscured. It is in the gap between material complexity and narrative simplification that the superpower becomes most visible, not as a clearly defined entity, but as a pattern of influence that resists full integration into later historical frameworks. Some scholars suggest that what is missing is not a single civilization, but a transitional system that bridged earlier and later forms of political organization. In this view, the so-called superpower may represent a phase of integration and standardization that was later replaced by more familiar imperial models. Once those models took hold, the transitional system lost its distinct identity and historical memory. However, this interpretation still does not fully account for the consistency of its material footprint across regions. Transitional systems tend to leave uneven traces, but here the evidence suggests a level of coordination that extends beyond simple transition. The possibility remains that later empires inherited the infrastructure and administrative frameworks of this earlier system so thoroughly that its original identity became redundant. If its institutions were repurposed rather than replaced, then its disappearance from historical narrative would be the result of functional continuity without cultural recognition. In such a scenario, the superpower did not vanish because it was destroyed, but because it ceased to be recognized as distinct. Its systems lived on under new names, its infrastructure continued under new authorities, and its identity dissolved into the administrative background of successor states. And yet, even this explanation leaves behind an unresolved tension. The archaeological signature is too coherent to be purely accidental, too widespread to be purely local, and too structured to be entirely anonymous. What remains is a civilization that appears in the record only through its effects, not its name, a presence inferred from trade, architecture, administration, and diplomacy, but absent from the narratives that survive. And so the competing kings, with their competing stories, may not have erased this superpower in a single act of propaganda. Instead, they may have slowly rewritten the conditions under which it could be remembered at all, until all that remained was a world that still carried its influence, but no longer recognized the hand that shaped it. Long before any empire declares itself permanent, the ground beneath it is already negotiating its limits. Rivers shift course in ways that no king can command. Rainfall patterns drift across centuries, reshaping harvests, migration routes, and the fragile balance that holds complex societies together. In the case of the forgotten superpower, the archaeological and environmental record begins to converge on a quieter but more persistent force than war or propaganda climate itself. The late Bronze Age world was not stable. It was a period marked by fluctuations in temperature, extended drought phases in some regions, and increased variability in agricultural output across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Tree ring data, lake sediment cores, and ice records all suggest a sequence of environmental stress events that unfolded over generations rather than in a single catastrophic moment. These changes did not destroy civilizations instantly, but they weakened the systems that sustained them. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In river-based societies, stability is never purely political. It is hydraulic, agricultural, and ecological. Irrigation systems depend on predictable flows. Crop yields depend on seasonal reliability. Urban populations depend on surplus storage that assumes continuity in production. When any one of these variables begins to fluctuate beyond a certain threshold, the entire administrative structure begins to strain. For a civilization that appears in the archaeological record as highly organized and administratively sophisticated, such strain would not immediately result in collapse. Instead, it would manifest as fragmentation. Smaller regions would begin to manage resources independently. Local authorities would take over functions once coordinated centrally. Trade routes would become less predictable, and long-distance exchange would slow or reroute. This gradual breakdown of coordination is consistent with what appears in the material record associated with the mysterious cultural horizon. Standardized systems that once appeared across wide regions begin to show regional variation. Administrative seals become less uniform. Urban planning loses some of its earlier consistency. These are not signs of sudden destruction, but of a system under prolonged pressure. What makes climate instability particularly relevant in this case is its uneven impact. Drought does not affect all regions equally. Mountainous areas may retain water sources while lowland agricultural centres suffer. River valleys may shift productivity while coastal regions experience different forms of disruption. This unevenness produces migration, competition, and localised collapse rather than a single unified failure. As populations move, they carry with them fragments of administrative and cultural systems. But these fragments do not always integrate cleanly into new environments. Institutions that once functioned under centralised coordination may become redundant or incompatible with local conditions. Over time, this leads to a loss of structural coherence across the wider system. Some regions associated with this forgotten superpower show precisely this kind of transformation. Long-term settlement continuity exists, but the administrative signatures change. It is as if the same population base adapts to new political and environmental realities without maintaining the same overarching identity. However, climate alone cannot fully explain the disappearance of the civilization from historical narrative. Environmental stress explains fragmentation, migration, and economic disruption, but it does not fully account for the consistent reduction of identity in external records. Civilizations affected by climate change are usually still remembered by their neighbours, even if in simplified form. Names persist, stories survive, catastrophes are recorded. In this case, the memory is unusually thin. This is where environmental explanation begins to intersect with broader processes of transformation. Climate stress weakens systems, but it does not erase them. What it does is accelerate conditions under which political and cultural restructuring becomes more likely. As resources become scarce and populations shift, competing powers fill vacuums, reorganize territories, and redefine historical narratives in ways that reflect new realities. In the late Bronze Age collapse, this process is visible across multiple regions. The breakdown of palace economies, the disruption of trade networks, and the movement of so-called sea peoples are all part of a broader pattern of systemic stress. Within this turbulence, even powerful states can lose coherence quickly, especially if their administrative systems depend on stable environmental conditions. For the forgotten superpower, this may have meant a gradual loss of central coordination rather than a single dramatic fall. Administrative regions could have continued functioning independently, while the overarching structure weakened. Over time, successor systems would emerge, each inheriting parts of the old framework without preserving its unified identity. This kind of transition leaves a particular archaeological signature continuity at the local level combined with discontinuity at the systemic level. Cities remain occupied, but their roles change. Trade continues, but routes shift. Technologies persist, but organisational frameworks evolve. Yet even this model does not fully resolve the question of historical silence. If the system fragmented rather than collapsed, why is its identity so faint in later records? One possibility is that later civilizations encountered not a unified successor, but a mosaic of fragmented regions that no longer recognized their shared origin. In such a scenario, external observers would record what they saw at the time: smaller polities, shifting alliances, and localized powers. The memory of the earlier system would already be fading internally, making it less likely to be preserved externally. Over time, as new empires rose and consolidated control, the fragmented remnants of the earlier system would be absorbed into broader administrative and cultural frameworks. Once absorbed, their distinct identity would become harder to isolate in historical memory. Climate change, in this sense, does not erase civilizations directly. It changes the conditions under which memory is preserved, transmitted, and eventually reconstructed. There is also evidence that environmental stress may have interacted with social and political factors in complex ways. Resource scarcity often increases competition between regions, which can accelerate fragmentation. Internal tensions may rise as administrative systems struggle to allocate diminishing resources. In such conditions, centralized authority becomes harder to maintain, even if it has not been directly overthrown. Some scholars suggest that the superpower's disappearance from historical narrative may be the result of this combined pressure. Environmental instability weakening the system internally, while external powers reinterpret and absorb its remnants externally. This layered process produces a kind of double invisibility. Internally, the system dissolves into regional units that no longer preserve a unified identity. Externally, successor civilizations record only the fragments they encounter, without reconstructing the original structure behind them. The result is a civilization that is archaeologically present but narratively fragmented. What remains particularly striking is that even in regions where environmental conditions recovered in later periods, the earlier identity does not re-emerge in historical records. Instead, new political formations establish themselves without clearly referencing the preceding system. This suggests that the loss of identity was not simply temporary disruption, but a deeper transformation in how the past was understood and recorded. In this way, climate change becomes not only a physical force, but an indirect force on memory itself. By reshaping populations, economies, and political structures, it alters the conditions under which history is written and preserved. And within that altered landscape, the superpower that once coordinated regions, standardized systems, and influenced diplomacy across vast distances begins to fade, not because it was singularly destroyed, but because the framework that sustained its recognition no longer existed. What survives is not its absence, but its transformation into something unrecognizable, a network without a name, a system without a centre, a history that continues to operate in fragments, even as its original form slips beyond the reach of narrative recovery. Beneath the modern surface of cities and farmland that now stretch across the ancient Near East, the past does not always lie in neat layers. Sometimes it folds, compresses, and hides itself in ways that make older worlds appear suddenly closer than expected. A wall unearthed beneath a later settlement does not always belong to a different civilization. Sometimes it belongs to the same one, only under a different name, or under no name at all. This is the strange challenge posed by cities buried in plain sight, where continuity and disappearance exist in the same soil. In the regions connected to the forgotten superpower, this phenomenon becomes especially significant. Excavations repeatedly reveal urban centres that do not fit cleanly into the expected historical sequence. Some lie directly beneath later occupation layers, suggesting that entire cities were rebuilt rather than abandoned. Others appear partially integrated into later urban planning, as if their original layout influenced successive generations, even when their original identity was no longer recognised. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What makes these buried cities so important is not simply their existence, but the way they challenge assumptions about rupture and replacement in ancient history. Traditional narratives often describe civilization change as a series of clear transitions. One culture collapses, another rises, but the archaeological reality is often far more ambiguous. Instead of clean breaks, there are layers of adaptation, reuse, and gradual transformation. In several key excavation sites, architectural continuity becomes visible across centuries. Foundations of earlier buildings are incorporated into newer structures. Road systems are extended rather than replaced. Public spaces retain their orientation even when their administrative functions change. These patterns suggest that later societies did not always build on empty ground, but on inherited urban frameworks that retained functional value long after their original political context had disappeared. This raises an important question if the physical cities remained. Why did their political identity not survive in the same way? One explanation is that identity and infrastructure do not always move together. A city can persist physically while its governing system dissolves. Administrative centres may shift, elites may change, and written records may be restructured, but the physical landscape continues to support human habitation. Over time, new identities are built on top of old foundations, often without explicit acknowledgement of what came before. In the case of the forgotten superpower, this process appears to have been particularly extensive. Urban continuity is visible in multiple regions, yet the cultural and political labels attached to these cities shift significantly across time. A settlement that appears in earlier layers as part of a coordinated administrative network may later be described in vague geographic terms or absorbed into broader regional categories. This suggests that the disappearance of identity was not matched by an equivalent disappearance of infrastructure. Instead, what occurred was a gradual decoupling between place and political meaning. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. In some cities, administrative buildings are repurposed multiple times across different cultural phases. A structure originally designed as a bureaucratic centre may later function as a storage facility and later still as part of a residential district. Each transformation reflects changing social and political needs, but the underlying continuity of space remains visible. This reuse complicates attempts to assign clear cultural boundaries to ancient urban history. It becomes difficult to say where one civilization ends and another begins when the physical environment itself resists such divisions. One of the most intriguing aspects of buried cities is the way memory becomes embedded in architecture even when written records disappear. Urban layouts can preserve earlier planning logic long after the administrative systems that created them have collapsed. Street grids, drainage systems, and defensive walls often continue to shape urban life in ways that outlast political identity. In this sense, cities become vessels of partial memory. They retain the shape of past decisions even when the reasons behind those decisions are forgotten. In regions associated with the mysterious cultural horizon, this architectural memory appears unusually persistent. Some cities maintain consistent spatial organisation across multiple cultural phases, suggesting that later populations either inherited or adopted earlier planning principles without fully preserving their origin stories. This creates a situation where the physical city remains coherent, but its historical identity becomes increasingly fragmented. At the same time, there are instances where cities appear to have been deliberately restructured. Street patterns are altered, administrative zones are reorganised, and symbolic architecture is replaced. These changes may reflect shifts in political authority, but they also indicate a conscious effort to redefine urban identity. It is within this tension between continuity and restructuring that the question of buried identity becomes most complex. Cities are not simply destroyed and rebuilt. They are often reinterpreted, reshaped, and recontextualized in ways that obscure their earlier forms without completely erasing them. This process is particularly significant when considering the possibility of a large-scale political system underlying these urban networks. If a superpower once coordinated multiple cities across a wide region, its influence would likely be embedded in shared architectural and administrative principles. Even after its decline, those principles could persist in local urban planning traditions. However, persistence does not guarantee recognition. Later civilizations may adopt inherited systems without preserving their origin narratives. Over time, the memory of coordination becomes replaced by assumptions of independent development. Another factor contributing to this obscuring effect is sedimentation over time. As cities are rebuilt layer upon layer, earlier structures become physically buried and conceptually distant. What remains visible to later inhabitants is only the most recent phase of occupation. Earlier layers exist beneath the surface, but they no longer participate in daily life or collective memory. In this way, urban stratification mirrors historical stratification. The deeper layers of a city correspond to deeper layers of forgotten identity. Some excavated cities associated with this cultural horizon show unusually deep sequences of occupation, with repeated cycles of rebuilding that extend over centuries. Each cycle preserves elements of the previous one while introducing new cultural characteristics. The result is a palimpsest of urban life, where no single layer fully dominates the historical narrative. This complexity makes it difficult to isolate a singular moment of disappearance. Instead, what emerges is a gradual fading of distinct identity across multiple reconstruction phases. Even more intriguing is the fact that some later cities appear to align spatially with earlier, larger urban systems that are no longer fully visible in historical records. This suggests that modern or later ancient settlements may unknowingly follow patterns established by earlier, more extensive networks. If this is the case, then the forgotten superpower may still shape the geography of inhabited space, even if its name no longer survives. This idea challenges conventional understandings of disappearance. A civilization does not need to vanish physically for its identity to be lost. It only needs to be reinterpreted, absorbed, or overwritten across successive layers of occupation until its original coherence is no longer recognizable. In this sense, buried cities are not simply archaeological sites. They are active participants in the transformation of memory. They preserve fragments of earlier systems while simultaneously obscuring the context that once gave those systems meaning. As more cities are uncovered beneath later settlements, the pattern becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. There is a sense of underlying continuity that does not match the fragmented nature of written history. The ground itself suggests a more integrated past than the surviving texts are willing or able to describe. And so the cities remain, layered beneath time, carrying within their structures the faint outline of a civilization that once organized space, labor, and administration across a wide region, but whose identity has been dispersed into the architecture of its successors. What survives is not a clear narrative of collapse, but a landscape of overlapping histories, where each layer both reveals and conceals what came before. Language is usually the last thing a civilization loses, and often the first thing it leaves behind in the form of decipherable memory. Even when cities fall and administrations collapse, scripts tend to survive in fragments, carrying echoes of older worlds into newer ones. That is why the disappearance of a written system is rarely just a linguistic event. It is a cultural rupture that reshapes how history itself can be remembered. In the case of the forgotten superpower, the most unsettling clue is not what is preserved in writing, but what is missing from it. Across the regions associated with this cultural horizon, inscriptions appear in multiple layers of time, but with a noticeable shift in consistency. Earlier layers suggest the presence of structured administrative writing symbols, seals, and proto-systems that imply standardized communication. Later layers, however, show fragmentation. Scripts change, simplify, or are replaced entirely by neighboring systems. In some sites, the transition is abrupt. In others, it unfolds gradually over generations. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the first challenge in understanding this linguistic disappearance is identifying whether we are dealing with a single writing system or multiple regional variants. Archaeological evidence suggests that what once functioned as a shared administrative language may not have been uniform across all territories. Instead, it may have existed as a family of related scripts, adapted locally while maintaining structural similarities. This would explain both the consistency of certain symbols and the variation observed between regions. However, even this model struggles to fully account for the scale of discontinuity seen in the archaeological record. In several key sites, administrative writing appears fully developed in one layer, only to be replaced in later strata by entirely different systems with little evidence of transitional forms. Such abrupt shifts are difficult to reconcile with gradual linguistic evolution alone. One possible explanation is that writing was not universally embedded in all levels of society. Instead, it may have been restricted to administrative or elite contexts. If scribal knowledge was concentrated within specific institutions, then the collapse or transformation of those institutions could lead to rapid loss of written continuity. Without broad societal transmission, scripts can disappear within a few generations. This hypothesis is supported by the nature of the surviving inscriptions. Many appear highly formalized, tied to administrative functions such as taxation, inventory control, or diplomatic correspondence. There is relatively little evidence of informal or domestic writing in the regions associated with this culture, suggesting that literacy may have been specialized rather than widespread. Yet specialization alone does not explain the near-total absence of a stable textual tradition in later historical memory. Even restricted writing systems tend to leave behind more continuous traces, especially if they are associated with powerful political entities. The more influential a system, the more likely it is to be preserved, adapted, or referenced by successor cultures. This brings attention to another possibility that the writing system itself may have been deliberately replaced or absorbed. Throughout ancient history, conquering or succeeding powers often impose their own administrative scripts to standardize governance. Over time, this can lead to the extinction of earlier writing traditions, even if elements of them persist in modified form. In such cases, older scripts do not disappear entirely. They are often partially integrated into new systems, leaving behind subtle traces in vocabulary, syntax, or symbolic structure. However, in the regions linked to the forgotten superpower, these traces are unusually faint or difficult to isolate. Some scholars have noted that certain symbols found in early inscriptions appear to re-emerge in later, unrelated scripts, but without clear evidence of direct continuity. This raises the possibility that elements of the older system were absorbed into neighbouring linguistic traditions, losing their original context in the process. The problem of linguistic disappearance is further complicated by the uneven survival of materials. Clay tablets preserve writing more effectively than organic materials, but they represent only one segment of ancient communication. If a civilization relied heavily on perishable writing surfaces such as wood, leather, or papyrus-like materials, then much of its textual output would be lost to time. This would create an illusion of sudden disappearance, even if written communication continued in forms that did not survive archaeologically. However, even accounting for this, the lack of continuity in administrative scripts remains striking. One of the most intriguing aspects of the linguistic record is the presence of undeciphered inscriptions that resist classification. These texts appear structured enough to suggest meaning, yet they do not fully align with known language families of the region. Attempts to link them to neighbouring systems have produced only partial correspondences, often inconsistent or speculative. These undeciphered elements may represent regional dialects, transitional scripts, or entirely separate linguistic traditions that were later replaced. Their existence, however, reinforces the idea that the linguistic landscape of the region was once more diverse and complex than the surviving record suggests. As writing systems disappear or transform, they take with them more than just language. They remove access to administrative logic, cultural memory, and political identity. Without written continuity, civilizations become increasingly dependent on oral tradition, which is far more vulnerable to distortion and loss over time. Oral transmission can preserve stories, but it tends to compress complexity. Names are simplified, events are reordered, and entire systems of governance can be reduced to symbolic or mythological representations. If the forgotten superpower's written tradition collapsed or was replaced early, much of its internal structure could have been transformed into legend or absorbed into the narratives of neighbouring cultures. This process may help explain why references to the civilization in later sources are so vague. Instead of detailed administrative records, what survives are generalised descriptions, geographic labels, or mythologized echoes of earlier interactions. Another dimension of the problem lies in the role of scribal institutions. In many ancient societies, scribes formed specialized professional classes responsible for maintaining records. These groups often preserved continuity across political transitions, ensuring that writing systems survived even when regimes changed. If such institutions were disrupted, whether through migration, collapse, or restructuring, the consequences for linguistic continuity would be severe. Without trained scribes to transmit knowledge, writing systems can disappear rapidly, especially if they are not widely adopted outside administrative contexts. Archaeological evidence from the regions in question suggests that scribal centres did exist, but their continuity appears uneven. Some sites show long-term use of administrative writing, while others show sudden breaks followed by the adoption of different systems. This patchiness suggests that scribal networks may have been vulnerable to the same pressures affecting broader political structures. There is also the possibility that linguistic replacement occurred as part of broader cultural integration. When regions come under the influence of dominant neighbouring powers, their administrative systems are often restructured to align with those of the dominant culture. Over time, this leads to gradual abandonment of local scripts in favour of more widely used ones. In such scenarios, the original writing system does not vanish violently, but fades through disuse. Each generation becomes slightly less familiar with the older script until it is no longer actively transmitted. What remains in the archaeological record, then, is not a continuous linguistic tradition, but isolated snapshots separated by gaps of uncertainty. These gaps are particularly important when considering the identity of the forgotten superpower. Without a stable written tradition, its self-representation is lost. Later civilizations may record interactions with it, but without its own voice preserved in parallel, those records become one-sided. This asymmetry shapes how history is reconstructed. A civilization that does not preserve its own textual identity is at the mercy of how others describe it. And if those descriptions are fragmented, inconsistent, or filtered through political interests, the original identity becomes increasingly difficult to recover. The linguistic disappearance, therefore, is not just about language. It is about control over narrative continuity. Once that continuity is broken, the ability to reconstruct a civilization's internal structure diminishes rapidly. What survives instead are partial echoes embedded in foreign texts, isolated inscriptions that defy classification, and material evidence that points to administrative complexity without providing a clear linguistic anchor. And so the superpower becomes linguistically invisible, not because it never spoke, but because its voice no longer survives in a form that can be fully recognized or understood. Across the broken diplomatic corridors of the ancient world, where messages once travelled along carefully maintained routes between kings, governors, and temple authorities, there is a strange pattern that becomes more visible the closer one looks. Civilizations that once appeared distinct in modern reconstructions begin to blur at the edges of their interactions. goods circulate more widely than political boundaries would suggest. Technologies appear in places where no clear narrative explains their arrival, and within this web of exchange, fragments of a forgotten system are repeatedly absorbed into the identities of others, until the original source becomes almost impossible to isolate. This is where the idea of rival empires absorbing the story begins to emerge, not as a single event, but as a long process of cultural assimilation and narrative compression across generations. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In the standard historical framework, the late Bronze Age world is often described as a network of competing powers: Egypt in the south, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Assyrian and Babylonian centers in Mesopotamia, and a range of smaller polities scattered across the Levant and Aegean. These entities interacted through trade, warfare, and diplomacy, forming a complex but recognizable system of interstate relations. Yet when archaeologists map the distribution of material culture across this same period, the boundaries between these powers become less rigid. Administrative tools, artistic motifs, and technological practices move across regions with surprising fluidity. What appears as distinct cultural zones in written history often looks far more interconnected in the material record. This discrepancy becomes especially important when examining the traces associated with the vanished superpower. Instead of appearing as a clearly defined political entity, it seems to surface indirectly through the systems of its neighbours. Its influence is present, but its identity is refracted through multiple lenses. In some cases, rival empires appear to have adopted or adapted administrative practices that likely originated in this earlier system. Standardized weights, bureaucratic organization, and even urban planning principles show signs of shared development or transmission. However, when these elements are recorded in surviving texts, they are attributed to local innovation or reinterpreted as independent evolution. This pattern of attribution is significant. It suggests that as political narratives were constructed, the origin points of certain systems were gradually reassigned to more dominant or better documented civilizations. Over time, this process of reassignment can obscure the role of earlier contributors, especially if those contributors no longer existed as independent political entities. One of the key mechanisms behind this absorption is economic integration. Trade networks in the ancient world were not merely commercial, they were deeply embedded in political and administrative systems. Standardization of weights and measures, regulation of goods, and control of trade routes all required some level of coordination. When a dominant power expands or consolidates influence over these networks, it often absorbs not just goods, but also the systems that regulate them. If the forgotten superpower once played a central role in establishing such systems, its administrative legacy could have been inherited by successor states without explicit acknowledgement of its origin. Another mechanism is institutional continuity through personnel. In many historical transitions, scribes, administrators, and craftsmen are retained by new regimes because their expertise remains valuable. These individuals carry institutional knowledge forward, but they do so within new political frameworks. Over time, their original affiliations become less visible, and their contributions are reattributed to the new ruling order. This process is subtle but powerful. It allows systems to persist while identities shift. The result is a form of historical layering in which older structures remain embedded within newer ones, but without clear recognition of their origins. In the archaeological record, this appears as continuity without attribution. Techniques and systems remain stable even as political labels change. For example, a standardized administrative method may persist across multiple cultural phases, but only the later phase is explicitly recorded in surviving texts. Rival empires also played a role in shaping this process through narrative consolidation. As states expanded their influence, they often absorbed not only territories but also histories. Conquered or integrated regions were incorporated into broader imperial narratives, which tended to emphasize the achievements of the dominant power while minimizing the distinct identities of earlier systems. This does not necessarily imply intentional suppression of history in a modern sense. Rather, it reflects the natural tendency of imperial narratives to prioritize coherence and legitimacy. Complex, multi-layered histories are often simplified into linear sequences that emphasize the rise of the current power and the decline of its predecessors. Within this framework, a previously influential civilization could be reframed as a precursor, a tributary region, or even a peripheral actor in a larger imperial story. Over generations, such reframing becomes embedded in historical tradition. Once a simplified narrative is established, it tends to persist, especially if it is reinforced by political authority and transmitted through educational or scribal institutions. This helps explain why the superpower in question appears so faint in later textual traditions. Despite its strong archaeological footprint, its role may have been gradually reduced in written history as rival empires consolidated their own narratives. There is also evidence that some rival states actively competed over historical legitimacy. In the ancient world, claiming continuity with prestigious predecessors was a powerful political tool. By associating themselves with older traditions, empires could enhance their authority and justify expansion. In such a context, multiple civilizations might selectively adopt elements of an earlier system, integrating them into their own histories while omitting acknowledgement of the original source. This creates overlapping claims of inheritance that obscure the true origin of certain administrative or cultural systems. The result is a kind of historical diffusion, where the influence of a lost civilization spreads across multiple successor states, but its identity becomes diluted in the process. One particularly intriguing aspect of this phenomenon is the asymmetry between material and textual evidence. Material culture preserves continuity in tools, architecture, and economic systems. Textual records, however, often reorganize or reinterpret that continuity in ways that align with contemporary political structures. This divergence suggests that what is preserved in stone, clay, and urban layout may reflect a deeper historical reality than what is preserved in narrative form. Rival empires may have inherited the infrastructure of the superpower without preserving its identity in writing. In some cases, even mythological traditions may preserve distorted echoes of earlier systems. Stories of ancient rulers, foundational civilizations, or legendary predecessors sometimes contain fragments of historical memory that have been transformed into symbolic or mythic forms. These narratives can act as indirect carriers of forgotten history, though they are difficult to interpret with precision. The cumulative effect of these processes is the gradual absorption of the superpower into the historical fabric of its successors. Rather than being remembered as a distinct entity, it becomes distributed across multiple traditions, each preserving only partial aspects of its existence. One empire may preserve its administrative methods, another may inherit its trade routes, a third may incorporate its architectural principles, but none preserve the complete system in its original form. As a result, modern reconstruction efforts must assemble a fragmented mosaic from multiple sources, none of which fully acknowledge the existence of the whole. This fragmentation is not accidental in outcome, but emergent from the way ancient political systems evolved, interacted, and recorded themselves. Rival empires did not need to consciously erase a predecessor for that predecessor to disappear from coherent memory. It was enough for each successor to reinterpret, absorb, and redistribute its legacy within their own frameworks. And so the superpower that once structured regions, standardized systems, and participated in international diplomacy does not vanish in a single moment. Instead, it dissolves into the competing narratives of those who came after it, leaving behind influence without attribution, structure without name, and memory without center. What remains is a world where history is still present in every system, but its origin point has been scattered across time and power until it can no longer be easily traced. In the discipline of archaeology, there is a constant tension between what the ground reveals and what historical narratives are willing to admit. Excavations do not simply uncover objects, they uncover contradictions. A wall does not lie, but its meaning can be endlessly reinterpreted depending on the framework applied to it. Nowhere is this tension more visible than in the growing body of evidence that challenges long-standing assumptions about the structure of the ancient Near East. As more material is recovered, it becomes increasingly clear that modern historical models may not fully account for the complexity of what once existed. This is where archaeology against memory becomes more than a concept. It becomes a collision between physical evidence and inherited narrative structure. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, archaeology operates on a principle that is deceptively simple. The deeper the layer, the older the evidence, but interpretation is never simple. The same layer can be read as evidence of collapse, transition, migration, or continuity depending on the assumptions brought to it. In the case of the forgotten superpower, this interpretive flexibility becomes a source of tension, because the material record does not fit neatly into any single explanatory model. Across multiple excavation sites, researchers encounter architectural continuity that spans cultural phases. Cities that appear to change political identity do not always show corresponding changes in urban structure. Streets remain aligned with earlier layouts. Drainage systems continue to function across successive occupations. Even monumental architecture is sometimes reused or incorporated into later constructions with minimal alteration. This continuity suggests that political change did not always coincide with physical rupture. Instead, identity shifted while infrastructure persisted. That alone is not unusual in ancient history. What makes this case different is the scale and consistency of that persistence across a wide geographic region. At the same time, textual records from later periods often fail to reflect this continuity. Historical narratives tend to describe clearer breaks between civilizations than the archaeological record supports. Entire phases of occupation are simplified into categories such as predecessor, dark age, or intermediate period, even when material evidence suggests ongoing complexity. This divergence raises a critical question: is the archaeological record revealing what history forgot, or what history chose not to preserve? One of the most important insights from modern archaeology is that memory and material reality do not always align. Societies remember selectively, they emphasize certain transitions while compressing or omitting others. Over time, these narrative choices become embedded in tradition, creating a historical framework that feels complete even when it is structurally incomplete. In the case of the ancient superpower, this gap becomes particularly pronounced. The material evidence suggests sustained complexity, administrative coordination, and widespread influence. Yet the narrative record often treats the same regions as fragmented, transitional, or peripheral. This mismatch is not easily explained by preservation bias alone. While it is true that some records are lost due to environmental conditions, destruction, or material decay, the pattern here is too consistent across multiple independent sources to be purely accidental. Instead, What emerges is a layered distortion. Archaeology preserves the structural reality of ancient systems, while historical memory preserves a simplified version of their evolution. The further back one moves in time, the more pronounced this divergence becomes. One of the most striking examples of this tension is the treatment of early urban centres. In several regions associated with the forgotten superpower, cities show continuous occupation across centuries. However, in historical narratives, these same cities are often described as emerging independently in later periods, as if their earlier phases were unrelated or insignificant. This creates the impression of sudden urban development where archaeological evidence clearly indicates long-term continuity. Such reinterpretations may arise from the limitations of later historical knowledge. When scribes or historians lack access to earlier records, they reconstruct the past based on visible remains and contemporary understanding. In doing so, they may inadvertently reframe continuous systems as discrete historical events. Over time, these reconstructions become authoritative. Once embedded in historical tradition, they shape how future generations interpret both texts and material evidence. This is where archaeology begins to challenge not just gaps in memory, but the structure of memory itself. In some cases, reinterpretation may also be influenced by political needs. As discussed in earlier sections, successor states often reshape historical narratives to emphasize their own legitimacy. In such contexts, continuity with earlier systems may be downplayed in favor of narratives that highlight emergence, innovation, or conquest. This does not require deliberate falsification. It can occur through gradual reinterpretation, selective emphasis, and the natural evolution of storytelling traditions. But the cumulative effect is the same, a flattened historical landscape in which complex systems are reduced to simplified sequences. The forgotten superpower appears particularly vulnerable to this process because of its structural characteristics. If it operated as a distributed system, rather than a single centralized empire, its identity would have been less visible in narrative form even while its influence remained widespread in material form. Distributed systems are inherently difficult to represent in linear historical narratives. They do not have a single founding moment, a single capital, or a single ruling dynasty. Instead, they function through networks of coordination that can easily be fragmented in later accounts. This fragmentation becomes even more pronounced when successor civilizations inherit parts of the system without inheriting its overall structure. Administrative techniques, trade routes, and architectural principles can survive independently of the political framework that originally organized them. As a result, what remains in the archaeological record is a set of interconnected systems without a clearly defined center. Another complicating factor is the uneven survival of sources. Archaeology is fundamentally shaped by what has survived rather than what once existed. Organic materials decay, written records are destroyed, entire archives can disappear through environmental or human processes. What remains is always partial. However, even accounting for this limitation, the distribution of evidence associated with the superpower remains unusually consistent across wide regions. It does not resemble isolated pockets of influence, but rather a structured network that once functioned across multiple zones. This suggests that the missing elements are not random, but systematic. One of the most important insights emerging from recent research is that absence in the historical record does not always indicate absence in reality. It can indicate transformation in how information is stored, transmitted, or prioritized. If later societies did not recognize certain systems as distinct or significant, they may not have preserved detailed records of them. Over time, these systems would be absorbed into broader categories, losing their specific identity. In this sense, archaeology becomes an act of recovery not just of objects, but of categories that no longer exist in historical language. The challenge, however, is that reconstruction must rely on frameworks created after the fact. Modern scholars interpret ancient evidence through conceptual models shaped by later historical developments. This can inadvertently reinforce the very simplifications that obscured earlier complexity. As new discoveries accumulate, these models are continuously adjusted, but rarely fully replaced. What emerges is a layered understanding of the past in which different forms of evidence point in different directions. Material culture suggests continuity and integration. Textual tradition suggests fragmentation and separation. Neither is entirely wrong, but neither is complete. In the space between these perspectives lies the unresolved identity of the forgotten superpower. It is present in infrastructure but absent in narrative, visible in systems but missing from names, preserved in function but lost in form. And as archaeology continues to push deeper into the strata of ancient life, it becomes increasingly clear that the past is not simply waiting to be discovered, it is actively being reconstructed through the tension between what was preserved and what was forgotten. The superpower in this sense is not entirely lost. It is redistributed across evidence, embedded in systems that survived it, and obscured by the narratives that followed. What archaeology reveals is not its absence, but its transformation into something that no longer fits the categories used to describe it. As the scattered evidence is pulled together from excavation reports, fragmentary inscriptions, and environmental reconstructions, a strange realization begins to take shape among researchers who study the deeper structure of the ancient Near East. The problem is no longer simply identifying what existed, but determining how much of what existed can still be meaningfully named. When too many fragments point toward the same direction without ever forming a complete picture, interpretation begins to shift from reconstruction toward approximation. This is where the attempt to reconstruct the lost superpower becomes most fragile, and at the same time most revealing. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what scholars are dealing with is not a single unified dataset, but a convergence of partial systems, administrative remnants that suggest coordination, trade patterns that suggest integration, architectural continuities that suggest shared planning logic, and diplomatic traces that suggest sustained interaction across regions. Each category, taken alone, can be explained within conventional models of ancient history, but when viewed together, they begin to imply something larger than any single explanatory framework comfortably allows. The difficulty lies in synthesis. Archaeology excels at detail, but struggles with totality. It can reconstruct cities, economies, and technologies with remarkable precision, yet it is far less certain when asked to define the overarching political or cultural structures that connected them. In the case of this forgotten superpower, the evidence repeatedly points toward connection without ever clearly defining the centre of that connection. This has led to a cautious shift in how some researchers frame the problem. Instead of asking what this civilization was, they increasingly ask what kind of system could produce the kind of traces that are being found. The answer, while still uncertain, tends to converge on a model that is neither fully centralized nor fully fragmented. It may have been a layered system of governance, where authority was distributed across multiple centers that shared administrative standards, economic frameworks, and cultural practices without relying on a single dominant capital in the way later empires did. Such systems are difficult to recognize in historical records precisely because they do not conform to the narrative expectations of empire as a singular entity. In this model, what appears as absence in the written record may actually reflect a different form of political organization, one that was never designed to be recorded as a unified identity in the first place. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for the degree of erasure observed in later traditions. Distributed systems still tend to leave recognizable traces in historical memory, especially when they interact with centralized empires that document their own diplomatic and military engagements. The relative silence surrounding this system remains unusually persistent. One possible explanation is that what we are observing is not simply a missing civilization, but a reclassification of historical categories over time. As later empires rose and developed their own frameworks for understanding political space, earlier systems may have been absorbed into broader regional labels that no longer preserved their internal distinctions. In other words, what was once a structured network could have been reinterpreted as a collection of loosely connected regions, effectively dissolving its identity within newer conceptual maps of the ancient world. This process of reclassification is subtle, but powerful. Once a complex system is described in simplified terms, future generations tend to inherit that simplification rather than the original complexity. Over time, the simplified version becomes the dominant historical reality, not because it is more accurate, but because it is more transmissible. Archaeology resists this simplification because it preserves detail without interpretation. But even archaeology is not immune to the frameworks used to organize its findings. Excavated sites must be categorized, assigned cultural labels, and placed within chronological sequences. These classifications, while necessary, inevitably shape how evidence is understood. In the case of the forgotten superpower, this tension becomes particularly visible. Sites that appear to belong to a coherent system are often assigned to multiple overlapping cultural categories, depending on regional variation, excavation history, or interpretive tradition. The result is a fragmented academic map that mirrors the fragmentation seen in historical narratives. This fragmentation is not necessarily incorrect, but it may be incomplete. One of the most compelling aspects of the accumulated evidence is the persistence of underlying systems even when political identities shift. Standardized measurements, architectural principles, and administrative practices appear to survive across transitions that otherwise suggest significant cultural change. This continuity implies that certain foundational systems were resilient enough to outlast the political structures that originally produced them. If so, then the disappearance of the superpower may not represent the disappearance of its systems, but rather the disappearance of its capacity to be recognized as a unified entity. This distinction is crucial. A system can persist without being identified as a system. It can continue to function while its origin is forgotten. It can be inherited without being named. Such a process would produce exactly the kind of evidence seen in the archaeological record: continuity without attribution, structure without narrative, and influence without identity. At the same time, environmental and social disruptions continue to provide a background of instability that accelerates these processes. As discussed earlier, climate fluctuations, resource stress, and population movements would have placed significant pressure on any large-scale system. Under such conditions, administrative coherence can weaken rapidly, especially if communication networks are disrupted. Once coordination breaks down, local adaptation becomes necessary. Regional authorities begin to act independently. Economic systems fragment. Over time, what was once a coordinated structure becomes a series of loosely connected adaptations. Later civilizations encountering this fragmented landscape would not perceive a unified system. They would see only its remnants, distributed across regions and reinterpreted according to local conditions. This is where historical memory begins to diverge most sharply from archaeological reality. Memory tends to organize the past into coherent sequences, while archaeology reveals overlapping and often contradictory layers. The further back one moves, the more pronounced this divergence becomes. In the absence of a stable narrative framework, later cultures reconstruct the past in ways that reflect their own political and cultural needs. Earlier systems are categorized, renamed, or absorbed into broader historical templates that simplify complexity into recognizable forms. Over time, this process creates a historical landscape in which the original system is no longer identifiable as a distinct entity, even if its components remain visible. The superpower, in this sense, does not disappear because it is destroyed. It disappears because it is no longer framed as something that can be seen in its original form. What remains is a distributed legacy infrastructure that continues to shape settlement patterns, administrative techniques that survive in adapted forms, and cultural influences that persist without clear attribution. Each of these elements points back toward a larger structure that once existed, but none of them preserves it intact. And so the reconstruction of the superpower becomes an exercise in assembling absence, not filling in missing pieces, but recognizing that the pieces themselves belong to a system that can no longer be fully reconstructed within the categories available. The closer researchers come to understanding it, the more it seems to recede into a space between definition and disappearance. A system once large enough to influence regions, now visible only through its residual effects. What archaeology reveals at this stage is not a civilization waiting to be rediscovered in full, but a structure that has been dispersed so thoroughly across time, space, and interpretation that its original form can only be inferred, never fully recovered. And in that sense, the superpower is not lost. It is transformed into something that survives only as pattern, influence, and trace present everywhere, yet named nowhere. In the final layers of this long reconstruction, where interpretation begins to thin and only the most persistent traces of evidence remain, the question of the forgotten superpower no longer feels like a search for a lost civilization in the traditional sense. It becomes something closer to an inquiry into how history itself decides what is allowed to remain visible. Not all disappearances are sudden, some are distributed so widely across time, culture, and narrative that they stop appearing as disappearance at all and begin to resemble the natural order of things. What emerges at this stage is not a single conclusion, but a convergence of patterns that refuse to separate cleanly. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Across all the strands of evidence, archaeological, linguistic, diplomatic, environmental, there is a recurring structure that appears again and again. Systems exist where names do not. Influence spreads where identity is unclear. Coordination is visible in material form, yet absent in narrative recognition. This mismatch is not confined to one region or one type of evidence. It repeats across multiple categories, suggesting that the issue is not a gap in data, but a gap in recognition. In earlier periods of research, this would have been treated as a set of unrelated anomalies, but as more discoveries accumulate, the anomalies begin to align. Standardized systems without clear origin points, trade networks without fully documented centers, administrative practices that appear suddenly, fully formed, then persist without a clearly defined source of development. Each of these patterns, taken alone, can be explained within conventional archaeological and historical models, but together, they suggest something more uncomfortable: that the framework used to define ancient civilizations may not be sufficient to describe what actually existed. The idea of a superpower, in the modern sense, implies a centralized state with clearly identifiable leadership and territorial boundaries, but the system reconstructed through these fragments does not fully conform to that model. Instead, it appears as a distributed structure of influence, coordination, and shared standards that operated across regions without necessarily relying on a single visible center. If such a system existed, its disappearance from historical memory becomes easier to understand, but not less significant. A distributed system is inherently more difficult to name, because its identity is not concentrated in one place or one dynasty. It is embedded in relationships, practices, and infrastructures that persist even when the original coordinating framework fades. Over time, successor civilizations would naturally inherit parts of this system without necessarily preserving its unified identity. They would continue to use its trade routes, adopt its administrative methods, and build upon its urban layouts, but reinterpret these elements within their own emerging narratives. What once functioned as an integrated system would gradually be divided into separate cultural and political lineages. In this process, the original coherence of the system will be lost not through destruction, but through redistribution. This redistribution is what creates the illusion of absence. The components remain, but the structure that connected them is no longer recognized. At the same time, historical memory tends to favor simplification. Later empires and scribal traditions organize the past into sequences of rise and fall, emergence and decline, victory and collapse. These narratives are powerful because they are easy to transmit and reinforce political legitimacy, but they are also reductive. They compress complex overlapping systems into linear stories that often erase intermediate forms of organization. The forgotten superpower may represent one of those intermediate forms too complex to fit neatly into later categories, and too diffuse to survive as a single narrative identity. Environmental factors, as discussed earlier, likely contributed to this transformation. Climate instability, resource stress, and migration patterns would have weakened centralized coordination and encouraged regional adaptation. But these forces alone do not erase identity. They create conditions for change, not for total narrative disappearance. The more decisive factor appears to be the interaction between fragmentation and reinterpretation. As systems broke apart, successor states inherited not only physical infrastructure, but also the responsibility of describing the past. In doing so, they reorganized inherited complexity into more manageable historical frameworks. Over generations, these frameworks became dominant. Once embedded in cultural memory, they shaped how the past was understood, taught, and recorded. The original system, no matter how influential it once was, became increasingly difficult to distinguish within this reconstructed narrative landscape. And yet, archaeology continues to resist this simplification. The ground preserves relationships that texts no longer describe. Settlement patterns reveal coordination that written history does not fully acknowledge. Standardized systems persist across regions where no single narrative accounts for their origin. This tension between material continuity and narrative fragmentation is where the forgotten superpower remains most visible. It is not visible as a single name or capital or dynasty. It is visible as a pattern that persists across multiple domains without a clearly defined source. A logic embedded in infrastructure, a structure embedded in trade, a coordination embedded in administrative practice. What disappears, then, is not the system itself, but the ability to describe it as a unified entity. In the final analysis, the question shifts once again. It is no longer only about what this superpower was, but about why systems of its kind become difficult to recognize in historical memory. Whether it is due to environmental disruption, political transformation, linguistic fragmentation, or narrative simplification, the result is the same: a coherent structure reduced to scattered traces. And those traces, when assembled, suggest that the ancient world was more interconnected, more layered, and more structurally complex than the surviving narratives allow. The superpower that history seems to have erased may never have existed in the form later imagination expects, or it may have existed in a form that does not survive well within the boundaries of traditional historical storytelling. Either way, its presence remains encoded in the systems it left behind. Not as a lost empire waiting to be rediscovered intact, but as a distributed legacy that continues to shape what came after it, even in its absence from memory. And so the final image is not of disappearance, but of diffusion, a civilization not erased in a single moment, but dispersed across time until its identity could no longer be gathered into one name. What remains is a world still built upon its foundations, still moving through its structures, still shaped by its influence without fully recognizing the source from which it came.